The wind comes off the Red Sea in the early part of the day before the heat has fully settled. A dry salt wind that moves over the pale stone and the pale sand and lifts nothing but the finest dust. And in that wind, on a morning in the April of 2013, a French archaeologist named Pierre Tallet is down on his knees in a place called Wadi al-Jarf, on the far Egyptian shore of that sea, at the mouth of a long row of galleries cut by hand into the living rock of the hillside, chambers hollowed out of the stone thousands of years ago, and then sealed and left. The oldest built harbour that has ever been found anywhere on the face of the earth. Older than you can easily hold in the mind, and he is not standing back to admire it. He is down close to the ground with the dust on his hands and his face near the stone, working at a narrow gap, a dark seam of shadow between two great blocks that fell long ago and came to rest against the mouth of one of the galleries and closed it like a door pulled almost shut. And into that gap, into the thin cool dark between the fallen blocks, he reaches, carefully. The way you would reach towards something you are half afraid to find, and his fingers close on something that is not stone, something light and dry and brittle and folded, and he draws it out into the morning light very slowly, holding his breath perhaps, and it is papyrus, a sheet of ancient papyrus folded upon itself, and gone the colour of old honey and old bone. And there is not one sheet but many, hundreds of fragments of it packed away in that seam of shadow, waiting, and as he lifts them one after another into the light of a day, more than 4,500 years after the last hand touched them, he is holding, though it will take time to be certain of it, the oldest inscribed papyrus that has ever been found on earth, the oldest written thing of its kind that has come down to us, the very oldest surviving pages of the human hand setting down human words. And you might imagine, if you have ever thought about such a moment at all, that the oldest writing in the world would turn out to be something grand and solemn to match its age, a hymn to a god, a spell to carry the dead safely through the dark, a king's boast cut to last forever, the sort of high and holy thing we expect the deep past to whisper up to us. But it is none of those. When the folded pages are opened and cleaned and read and slowly understood, they turn out to be something far humbler and to me far more wonderful than any hymn. Because what Pierre Tallet has drawn out of that gap between the fallen blocks is a logbook, a work diary. The daily record kept by a foreman, an ordinary working official, an overseer of a team of ordinary men, entered day after day in a plain and practical hand, where the crew went, what they carried, how the days were spent, the small ledger of a job of work, and the man who kept it, the man whose careful daily hand you are looking at across 4,500 years of silence, has a name, and the name is written there, and the name is Mirror. And Mirror, in his plain entries in the ordinary bookkeeping of his ordinary days, keeps naming a place, keeps writing down again and again the destination his crew is working toward, the great thing their labour is feeding, and the scribes of his time called that place Akhet Khufu, which means the horizon of Khufu. And the horizon of Khufu is a thing you have seen, a thing everyone alive has seen in some picture or another, standing gold and immense against a blue sky. Because Akhet Khufu is the name they gave to the Great Pyramid of Giza, and on the days that Mera sat down and wet his reed and wrote, the Great Pyramid was not the ancient ruin it is to us. It was new. It was rising. It was a work in progress on the near horizon, unfinished, its top not yet closed, and this tired practical man with his crew and his boat was one of the hundreds of thousands of ordinary hands that were in those very years raising it. Good evening and welcome back. Tonight I want to sit with you beside that logbook and beside the pyramid it names, and tell you the true and gentle and strange story of how that mountain of stone actually came to stand upon its desert, because it is the last of them, you know, the last one left. The ancient world once counted 7 wonders, 7 marvels a traveller ought to see before they died, and 6 of those 7 are gone now, thrown down by earthquake and war and time, vanished so completely that we argue about where some of them even stood. Only one is still there, Only one has stood through every single year of all of that, through the fall of 6 of its own brother wonders, and it is the oldest of the 7 by far, and it is still there this very night, out on its plateau above the river, exactly where they left it. And it is a marvel of stone, truly, and we will marvel at the stone. But more than the stone, tonight I want us to think about the men. The men who raised it. Because that is where the real story is, and it is a story that most of us were handed wrong, gently and without anyone meaning us any harm, but wrong all the same. We were handed, most of us, somewhere back in childhood, a picture of how this thing was built, and the picture goes like this: a sea of slaves, ragged and starving, tens of thousands of them driven under a hard sun, ropes cutting into raw shoulders, an overseer somewhere up on a rock with a whip in his hand, and the crack of that whip and the groan of the stone, and a cruel king far off who cared nothing for the lives spent on his tomb. That is the picture. And laid alongside it, or sometimes underneath it, we were handed a second story, quieter and stranger, that says the thing is simply too perfect, too vast, too precisely made for ordinary people to have built at all, and that there must have been some secret to it, some lost knowledge, some method we have forgotten, or some help from we know not where. And tonight, very gently, without any triumph in it, and without any scolding, we are going to take those stories down off the shelf where they have sat so long, and we are going to look at them honestly, and honour them for what they are, and then set them down, and in their place we are going to lay out what the ground itself says, not what a movie says, not what a legend says, what the earth of Giza, when people finally dug into it with care, actually turned out to hold. And before we take a single step further, I want to make you a promise about how we are going to do this. Because it matters to me, and I think on a night like this it will matter to you too, lying there in the quiet. Here is the promise. Everything I tell you tonight is going to come from things you could touch. That is the whole rule of it. Bones, real human bones, lifted from real graves. Bread pots, the actual clay moulds they baked in, dug up in their hundreds. Red paint, ordinary workman's paint, brushed onto blocks of stone by hands that meant nobody 4,500 years later would ever read it. Folded papyrus, like mirrors drawn out of the dark. Mud walls, the plain low walls of a plain town, still standing in their footprint in the sand. Things you could hold in your 2 hands. There will be no secret revelation in this story, no hidden chamber where the real answer is kept, no moment where I lean in and tell you what they never wanted you to know. There is none of that here, and I would not offer it to you if there were, because it would not be true. And the truth is better. And where the evidence runs out, because it does run out, in places. There are things about this that we simply do not know and may never know. Where it runs out, I am going to stop and tell you plainly that it runs out here, and we are going to sit at that edge together and look out into the dark and be honest that the dark is there. That is the contract. Touchable things, no secret revelations, and the plain truth wherever the ground goes quiet. Now let us settle in, because we have a long and peaceful way to go, and there is no hurry in any of it. Let your shoulders come down. Let them come down from wherever they have drifted up toward your ears across this long day, and then let them come down a little further than that, further than feels necessary, until you feel the whole line of them go soft and heavy and low. The day is over. Whatever you carried through it, whatever weight of doing and deciding and keeping going you have been holding up since morning, you can set that down now. All of it, because the single hardest job of the day, the job of carrying yourself through it, of being the one who holds you upright and moving and awake, that job is finished, and you are allowed to be finished with it. Let the jaw unhinge. We hold so much there without ever knowing it, in that small tired hinge below the ear. Let it come loose. Let the teeth part. let it hang easy. And let the breath go long. Not forced, not counted, not managed in any way, only allowed to lengthen of its own accord, to slow and to soften, and to find the low quiet rhythm it falls into all by itself, when nothing is asked of it. And if, somewhere in the middle of all this, before I have even got the logbook properly open, before we have so much as walked into the town or looked at the graves, you feel yourself beginning to slide down under the surface of the words towards sleep, then let yourself slide. That is not you failing to listen. That is not you missing the story. That is the whole idea. That is the entire purpose of the hour. That is the thing working exactly as it is meant to work. The pyramid has stood on its plateau for something on the order of 4,600 years, patient beyond any patience you or I could summon, in no hurry whatsoever, and it is certainly not going to mind if you drift off before we reach the end. It will keep the story warm for you. It has kept it warm this long. It will keep it warm until the next time. And let me ask you, as we settle, the small question I always like to ask about now. Where are you listening from tonight? A city, perhaps, with the sound of it coming faint through the glass, the far-off hush of traffic like a tide. A farmhouse, out where the dark is real dark and the quiet is real quiet. A room over a busy street, or a room over a quiet one. Somewhere with the rain coming down steadily against the window, that good sound, or somewhere with the summer air standing perfectly still and warm and not a leaf moving. Wherever it is, whatever the walls around you and whatever the weather beyond them, you are welcome here. This is a good place to be, and you are welcome in it, and this hour is yours. It asks nothing back from you. It is simply yours, to spend however sleep decides to spend it. So let the breath go long again, one more slow, easy length of it, in through the quiet and out through the quiet. And let me tell you, softly, the shape of the country we are going to travel through tonight, so that you always know roughly where we are, and never have to work to hold your place, because you will not be tested on any of it, and you are free to lose the thread whenever you like, and find it again further on. We are going to begin in a moment, not with the truth, but with the story we were told, with the whip and the secret and the rest of it, and we are going to hold each of those up to the light kindly before we let it go. And then we are going to walk, slowly, through the real things. We are going to walk into a town, a whole lost town, dug out of the sand right there beside the pyramids, where the people who built the great thing actually lived, with their bakeries and their breweries and the fish bones of their suppers still in the ground. We are going to look at red paint, at the marks that gangs of workmen brushed onto the stones, the names they gave themselves, one of which, when it was found, made the archaeologists go very quiet, because a gang had called itself the Friends of Khufu. We are going to sit for a while at the graves of the builders themselves, ordinary men and women laid in the ground with care and with honour, and with little loaves of bread and jars of beer for the road, their old healed injuries still readable in their bones. The record of hard lives tended and mended and respected. We are going to think, gently and without any strain, about ramps and sledges, about how you actually move a block of stone that weighs as much as a car when you have no wheel and no iron and no engine, but muscle and cleverness and a little water on the sand. And then, at the end, we are going to come back here, to this shore, to this wind off the Red Sea, and open Mera's diary properly, and read in the plain words of a working man dead 4,500 years, the record of the days when the Great Pyramid was still going up. That is the country. A myth, a town, some red paint, some graves, some ramps, and a diary. That is all it is. There is nothing frightening anywhere in it, no chase and no catastrophe, and nothing that will jolt you upright in the dark. There is only the slow warm pleasure of seeing a thing you thought you knew turn out to be truer and kinder and stranger than the version you were given. So let the last of the day's tightness go. Feel the weight of you settle down fully into whatever holds you, the mattress, the pillow, the chair, and let it be held, all of it, every ounce. You do not have to hold any part of yourself up any longer. And we will begin. But we will not begin with the truth. That is the thing I want to say to you before we take the first step, because it might seem strange, it might seem backward, to spend the opening of our night on a story I have already told you is wrong. And yet we must, and here is why, and it is the one small idea I would ask you to carry with you as you drift down toward the town and the graves and the red paint. We begin not with the truth, but with the myth, because you cannot set a thing down until you have honestly picked it up. You cannot lay a story gently aside if you have never really held it, never felt its weight, never understood why so many people for so many centuries believed it and needed it and passed it lovingly along. To simply say the myth is wrong and sweep it off the table would be a kind of unkindness, to them and to us. So instead, we are going to pick it up. We are going to take the old story of the slaves and the whip and the lost secret into our two hands, carefully, the way Pierre Tillet took the folded papyrus out of the dark. And we are going to turn it over and look at where it came from and understand it and honour it. And only then, once we have truly held it, will we be able to set it softly down and turn toward the town in the sand where the real builders left their bread and their bones and their names. And so let us begin there, with the story we were told, and lift it the way you would lift blankets from a sleeping thing, slowly, one at a time, folding each back with care, because there is a courtesy owed even to a story that turns out not to be true. And this one has kept people company for so many hundreds of years that it has earned a gentle setting down. There are 3 coverings, as I count them, laid one over another across the long ages, and none of them is a foolish story, and none of the people who believed them was a fool. So let us begin with the topmost, the heaviest and the oldest, the one I will call the whip. It is the story you know without ever having been taught it, the story that lives in the body before it lives in the mind. The slaves. Thousands upon thousands of them, ragged and sun-blackened, roped together in long straining lines, hauling the great stones up the endless ramp, while a man with a whip walks the line and brings it down upon the bare backs of those who falter. And above them all the cruel king in his linen, the God-King, who counts nothing of the lives spent to make his mountain. That is the picture, and notice how ready it is, how it needs no summoning, how it was waiting in you fully formed before I said a word, for that is the mark of a very old story, one worn so smooth by so much handling that it has stopped feeling like a story at all, and started feeling simply like the truth. Where did it come from? This picture in the blood. It came in the main from one man, a curious, endlessly gossiping Greek named Herodotus, who travelled down into Egypt around 450 years before the birth of Christ, and who is called the father of history, though a fair few have added, with a smile, that he is also the father of the tall tale, and both titles fit him, and I say neither unkindly. But here is the thing that changes how you must weigh every word he set down. When Herodotus stood on that plateau and asked the local people how the pyramid had been made, it was already unthinkably ancient. Something on the order of 2,000 years already stood between him and the king who had raised it, so that the gap between the curious Greek and the building he was gazing at was as wide, near enough, as the gap between you, lying here tonight, and the Rome of the Caesars. Sit with that a moment. He had no records he could read. The men who raised it had been dust for 20 centuries. There was no one left alive who knew. There were only guides and priests and whatever tales the people of his own late day happened to tell about the great stone mountains their unimaginable ancestors had left standing in the sand. What he wrote down then was not testimony, but hearsay gathered 2,000 years downstream, the folk story of a folk who were themselves already gazing up at a mystery, that a king he called Cheops, which is only the Greek way of saying Khufu, was a wicked and impious ruler who closed the temples and bent the whole nation to his single monstrous purpose, compelling the men of Egypt to labour in gangs of 100,000 at a time. each toiling 3 months and then relieved by another 100,000, on and on for 20 years. And you can see already how close it is to the picture in your blood, and yet how much is still missing, for even Herodotus, even in this darkest telling, does not clearly say the word slaves. But the story, once loose, did not stay as he left it. This is the part I find quietly fascinating. The way a tale hardens as it travels, sets like a footprint pressed into drying mud. The Roman writers pressed their own thumb into it. Later ages, reading their own bondage into that ancient sand, added the chains and the whip and the word slave. The pulpit took it up and made of it a sermon, the pyramids standing as the very emblem of a people held in cruel bondage in the land of Egypt, and that image sank down into the deep memory of whole civilizations. And then the moving picture found it, and oh, what it did with it. For nothing has ever burned an image into the common mind so hot and so fast as the cinema. And the cinema loved this one, loved the ragged rope lines and the glistening backs, the raised arm and the crack of the lash, the cruel king surveying his slaves from a golden chair. Magnificent cinema, all of it. And almost none of it true. I do not say that harshly, I only say it plainly, because we have promised each other plainness tonight, so let us fold it. The whip, laid down, and now, beneath it, there is a second covering, a stranger and finer weave, and it belongs not to those who believed in the slaves, but to those who could never quite believe them, who looked up at the pyramid and felt, rightly, that ropes and ramps and aching muscle were not answer enough for so vast a perfection, and who reached instead for a different word, and the word was secret. This is the blanket of lost knowledge, of hidden method, of some marvellous thing the ancients knew and we have forgotten, some machine that antiquity possessed and time mislaid, some concealed art of moving mountains or softening stone. And I want to be tender toward it, because it is born of a true and honest astonishment, the reasonable feeling that a thing so precise and so enormous cannot have come from something as plain as men and rope and time. Watch, though, how it changes its costume across the centuries, always the same figure underneath, only ever dressed in the fashion of its age. In the medieval centuries some gazed at the pyramids and saw not tombs but granaries, the very storehouses of grain that Joseph built against the years of famine. In the age of the Renaissance the pyramid became a locked library, a sealed vault of vanished wisdom. In the 19th century men took their measuring rods into the passages and came out convinced that the very inches of the building were a prophecy in stone, the whole of human history coded in its corridors. And in our own time the secret has become a power plant, a great engine of forgotten energy, a monument built to tolerances so fine that no ancient hand could have achieved them. The thread that runs through every one of these costumes is simply this: a secret flatters us. It flatters us to believe the ancients knew a marvellous thing we have forgotten, or that we alone are clever enough to have decoded it. It makes the world larger, and asks nothing of us in return, but that we keep it and pass it along, and a story that costs nothing and gives such a pleasant shiver will always find willing hands. So let us honour that shiver, and then gently fold this second blanket too. And now the third covering, the last and the lowest, and to my mind, the saddest, and I lift it with the most care of all. The third whisper says, more quietly, that no ordinary people could have built such a thing at all. Not the Egyptians, not those men of flesh and bread and mud brick houses. Those farmers along the river with their flint and their copper and their bare brown hands, they could not have done it, the whisper says, and therefore it must have been someone else, a vanished civilization of unimaginable skill, drowned beneath some ancient flood that raised the pyramid before it sank, or, further out still, visitors from somewhere beyond the sky. Anyone at all, the third story says, anyone but the Egyptians themselves. And I call it the saddest because, however it dresses itself as wonder, at its root it is a small refusal, a quiet unwillingness to grant, to ordinary human beings, to a people with dark skin and simple tools working 4,500 years ago along a muddy river. The credit for the most extraordinary thing that human hands have ever raised. It takes the achievement out of their hands and gives it to ghosts, to a lost super race, to the stars, to anyone but the actual mothers and fathers and sons and daughters who actually did it. And tonight, gently, we are going to give it back to them. So there they lie, the 3 blankets, folded and set aside under the lamp, the whip, the secret, and the others. And before we look at what they were covering, I want to do the one thing all 3 were honestly reaching for, which is to feel, truly feel, how astonishing the Great Pyramid is. Because the myth did not grow out of stupidity, it grew out of awe, out of standing at the foot of the thing and feeling the mind simply fail to hold it, and that awe is not the enemy of the truth tonight, it is the doorway to it. It is built of something on the order of 2 1/3 million blocks of stone, and that number does nothing at all in the mind, it is a fog of zeros, so let it go. Picture instead 1 block, of the ordinary common sort, weighing about what a small family car weighs, that much dead unhelpful weight, and many of them heavier still. And now understand that for this mountain to rise in the 20 years the old story gives it, a block of that weight had to be quarried and hauled and laid, finished and in its place, once every 2 or 3 minutes, hour upon hour. Through every working day, for 20 years without pause, steady as a slow pulse, like a heartbeat made of stone. I find that far more staggering than any secret. And when all those blocks were laid, the mountain stood 146 meters into the desert sky, as tall as a building of some 40 stories, and it stood that tall in a world where the very tallest thing most people would ever see in the whole of their lives was a tree. And then the fact that asks us simply to stop. Once finished, that pyramid became the tallest structure built by human beings anywhere on Earth, and it held that place not for a century, not for 5, but for something like 3,800 years. Let those years walk past you slowly in the dark. Babylon rose and hung its gardens and fell, and still the pyramid was the tallest thing on Earth. Troy was besieged and burned, and still it stood tallest. Rome climbed to the mastery of the world, and at last crumbled into ruin. And through all of it, the pyramid was still the tallest thing human hands had ever managed to lift toward the sky, until at last, only around the year 1300, a slender English cathedral spire climbed a few feet past its summit and quietly took the crown it had worn, alone, for very nearly 4,000 years. So you see why the myth was born, and why I will not mock a single soul who ever believed any of its 3 soft coverings, for the thing at the centre of them truly is one of the most astonishing objects in the world. But here is the sentence tonight stands upon. Almost every part of the story you were handed is wrong, and the true story is stranger and warmer than any of them. Not colder. Warmer, it has bread in it, and beer, and the names of men, and their broken and mended bones, and a foreman's grumbling diary. It has pride in it, and belonging, and rest. And the strangest part of all is where the true story was hiding, for it was never where anyone was looking. Everyone who wanted the answer went inside the pyramid. They crawled up its dark passages and sounded its hidden chambers and measured its every inch. But the men were never inside the pyramid. The answer lay outside it, beside it, below it, in the most ordinary ground imaginable, in the plain, unremarkable sand a little way off where nobody thought to look, where the builders had simply lived and eaten and slept and been buried, and that ordinary ground kept its secret patiently for 4,500 years, and then gave it up, when it finally gave it up, with no great expedition and no clever machine and no learned man at all. But by the simple accident of a single horse, one quiet evening, putting one of its feet down in the wrong place. So picture it, in the low gold of the desert evening, the Great Pyramid gone the colour of warm honey along its western face, and deep bruised blue along its eastern one, patient against the very first stars, and far below it, small as a moth on all that immensity of sand and stone. A single horse and its rider crossing the flat, unpromising ground to the south of the Sphinx, going nowhere in particular. Going home, perhaps, in the last of the light. Keep that picture soft and whole, because everything that follows begins right there, on that ordinary flat ground that no one had ever thought worth a second glance. The answer was never inside the pyramid, where the tomb robbers and the dreamers had been looking for 4,000 years. The answer was outside. The answer was underfoot. And it announced itself in the year 1990, not to a team with radar and a grant and a plan, but to a horse in the most ordinary and accidental way that any great thing has ever been found. There was a visitor to the plateau that day, an American out on horseback the way tourists have ridden at Giza for a century, crossing that stretch of low desert where the ground is nothing to look at, a plain of sand and grit and rubble that your eye slides straight over on its way to the monuments beyond. And the horse was walking. And then the horse was not walking, because one of its forelegs had come down on a patch of that ground that was not solid ground at all. Not soft sand, which gives and means nothing. Not buried stone, which stops you dead. The leg went through the crust of the surface and down into a hollow, an emptiness where there should have been earth and was not. And the horse stumbled and caught itself, and the rider looked down to see what the animal had put its foot into. And there, in the broken lip of the little hole the hoof had punched, was not sand and not natural rock, but something entirely out of place. A wall, a small neat wall of mud bricks, the humble grey-brown bricks of ancient Egypt. And they were not tumbled or scattered as rubble would be. They were laid in courses, one upon another in the deliberate ordered rows that only a human hand makes. A hand that meant to build something and build it to last. And that hand had laid those bricks and gone away, and the desert had covered the work over, and it had waited there in the dark just beneath the surface for 4,500 years, for someone to put a foot wrong and let a little light back in. I find that almost unbearably tender. We imagine discovery as a thunderclap, a sealed door swinging open, a golden mask lifted glinting from the dark. And sometimes it is. But far more often it is this: a horse's foot in a hole, a stumble on a flat evening, a wall of plain mud brick showing suddenly where there should have been nothing at all. This being Giza, the most watched and studied patch of desert on the whole of the earth, word of the little hole did not have far to travel, and it came to a young Egyptian archaeologist whose responsibility that ground was. A man whose name you may already know, Zahi Hawass. He was not yet the great public figure he would become. He was then the antiquities official charged with the care of the Giza Plateau, and when he heard that a wall had appeared where no wall was known, he came to look. He knelt down at the broken hole and did the thing that all the patience of that profession comes down to in the end, which is simply to look, and to touch very gently, and to let the thing tell you what it is. He brushed the loose grit away from the brickwork, following the line of it, and as he cleared it he saw that the wall did not run straight. It curved. The courses of brick, as they rose, leaned in, gathered inward, and a course of brick that curves inward as it rises is the beginning of a vault, an arch, a roof of brick closing itself over an empty space beneath, and a vault, out here over a hollow chamber, means one thing above all others, the thing that quickens the pulse of anyone who has spent their life in that desert. A vault means a tomb. He had knelt down at a hole a horse had made and put his hand on the shoulder of a buried tomb, and it was not one tomb. When they began, carefully to clear the ground around that first accidental hole, they found that the vaulted chamber had neighbours, and the neighbours had neighbours, tomb beside tomb beside tomb. And then, as they worked the slope of that low rocky knoll, tier upon tier of them climbing the rise, ranks of small vaulted chambers and little rounded domes of mud brick stepping up the hillside, so many that the counting ran from a handful into dozens, and from dozens on toward the hundreds, a whole hidden city of the dead spread across a slope that 10,000 tourists had ridden over without ever guessing what lay a hand's breadth beneath their horses' feet. But here is the thing that makes this cemetery different from every other burial place at Giza, and I give it to you gently, because it matters more than almost anything else we will speak of tonight. There was no gold. No golden masks, no alabaster, no chests of treasure, no walls of painted splendour. These graves were humble, built many of them not from fine-dressed limestone, but from mud brick and from the broken leftovers of building work, from chips and scraps and offcuts, from the very rubble of the great construction going on nearby, gathered up and shaped by loving hands into little vaults and little domes, modest and homely and made with what was to hand. These were not the tombs of kings, nor of the great nobles who lie in their grand mastabas in the shadow of the pyramids. These were the graves of ordinary people, working people. And as more of them came out of the sand, it became clear, slowly, wonderfully, exactly whose graves they were. They were the graves of the people who built the pyramids. The workers themselves, and the people who fed them and healed them and buried them, laid to rest here in their hundreds on a slope of the very plateau they had spent their lives building, in modest little tombs made from the scraps of their own great work. And they were laid here close enough that a mourner straightening up from the burial of a father or a brother, and lifting his eyes, would have found the whole of the sky filled with the pyramid, the thing that man had helped to raise, rising sheer and enormous above the little dome of his grave. They were buried in sight of their work, in the shadow of it, in the honour of it. And we will come back to these graves later, when the night is deeper, because the bones laid in them have quiet and astonishing things to tell us about how these people lived and how they were cared for. Things that break the old cruel story clean in half, but for now only hold the picture of that hidden cemetery climbing its slope in tears, the little vaults and the little domes, no gold in any of them, the workers of the pyramids sleeping in dignity within sight of the mountains they made. And now I must bring you the second name of the night, because the horse and the hole and the young archaeologist kneeling in the sand are only half of how the truth came to light. The other half belongs to a man who arrived at all of this by a road so strange that I could hardly invent it. His name is Mark Lehner, an American, and he would in time become one of the greatest living authorities on how the pyramids were truly built, the man who has mapped that plateau more patiently and more completely than almost anyone alive. But that is not how he began. He came to Egypt as a young man, drawn by the mystics, by the romantic idea that there was a secret at Giza far older and stranger than the Egyptologists would admit, and, remarkably, he came funded by people who believed in a lost and drowned civilization, believers in the prophecies of a sleeping seer who had spoken of Atlantis, of a vanished people of great wisdom, and of a hidden hall of records buried somewhere beneath the sands, waiting to be found. He was sent, in a sense, to look for that, to look, if we are honest, for Atlantis. And I do not say that to mock him, because what happened next is the very opposite of foolish. It is one of the most quietly honourable arcs a person can walk, because Mark Lehner did the one thing that a true seeker does, and a mere believer never can. He stayed, and he looked, and he let the evidence speak, and he let it change him. Year after year the ground told him, gently and without cruelty, that the mystics were wrong. There was no drowned civilization here, no hall of records, no lost superpeople. There was something else, something he had not come looking for, something that turned out, to his own slow surprise, to be far more wonderful than the dream that had brought him. The romance of Atlantis fell away from him, a season at a time, and in its place there rose the wonder of the real. And it was Lehner who asked, plainly, the question that changes everything. The question so simple a child could ask it, and so devastating that the whole ancient slander of slaves and whips cannot survive it. He looked at the sheer scale of the pyramids, and the tens of thousands it must have taken to build them, labouring not for a season but for decades, and he asked, simply, where did they sleep? Where are their houses, their fires, their pots, their bread? A workforce of that size, gathered in one place for that long, is not a work gang. It is a city. It is a population, a great living crowd who had to eat every day, and drink, and rest their bodies at night, and cook, and mend, and be born and fall ill and die, right there, for year upon year. and people, as Lena himself so beautifully put it, are the most wonderfully untidy of creatures. Wherever human beings live, they leave a mess behind them, the ash of their fires and the bones of their dinners and the broken shards of their pots and the crumbs of their bread, layer upon layer of the ordinary debris of being alive. If tens of thousands had truly lived and worked on that plateau for decades, then somewhere in that ground there had to be the vast, untidy trace of them, and here is the quiet blade of it. The old story, the slave horde driven by the lash, predicted that there would be nothing to find. Slaves driven and dying and buried in nameless pits leave no proud cemetery, no ordered town, no infrastructure, no sign of care. If the cruel story were true, the ground should have been empty of everything but suffering. So Lena and Hoas, the American who had come looking for Atlantis and the young Egyptian who had knelt at the horse's hole, set themselves through the whole of the 1990s to work the low, unpromising ground south of the Sphinx, to dig where the slave story said there was nothing, and the arithmetic of feeding a multitude said there had to be something. And they worked season upon season beside a landmark that had stood there in plain sight all along, a colossal wall of ancient stone so old and so massive that the local people had their own name for it, a name used longer than anyone could remember, Hayt el Gurab, the Wall of the Crow. And in the shadow of that great wall they lifted, a little at a time, over years of the most careful and unglamorous work imaginable, the very thing the myth had sworn could not exist. Not a camp, not a pit, not a place of misery. A town, a real, planned, purpose-built town, laid out with intention, with streets running through it, with blocks of buildings set out in order, with bakeries and storerooms and workshops and sleeping quarters, and, threaded through the whole of it, drains, actual drains, the plumbing of a community that meant to keep itself clean and fed and going, a settlement 4,500 years old rising course by course out of the sand under their brushes. The place where the pyramid builders lived, sitting exactly where the untidy truth of human beings said it had to be all along. And Mark Lena, who had come to Egypt to look for Atlantis, and found instead this, gave it the name it has carried ever since, a name with all the wonder of the old dream in it, and all the warmth of the new truth. For he called it the lost city of the pyramid builders. And that is where we will spend the deep middle of the night, walking that lost town slowly, in no hurry at all, building by building, because now that it lies open before us we are going to move through it the way you might wander a village at dusk, letting each thing we come to speak its plain piece of the true story. And we will begin where the men themselves began and ended each of their long working days, at the place where they lay down to sleep, in the long low buildings the excavators came to call the galleries. So let us go down into it, gently, the way you would step in out of the hard white glare of a desert afternoon into the long cool shade of a building, and stand a moment near the door, letting the eyes settle, letting the shapes come up slowly out of the dimness before you move. The first of the buildings we come to, the first sentence of the true story spelled out in mud brick, is the one the men lay down in, the galleries, and I want you to see them plainly before I tell you what they mean. Picture a set of long narrow buildings laid side by side, parallel, close ranked, set out not at random the way houses grow up in an old village, but on a plan, deliberately, evenly, in tidy blocks running like the teeth of a comb, one and then the gap and then the next, so regular that when you stand back and look down upon them, you know at once that a single mind laid this out, that someone stood on this ground with the whole thing already drawn in his head and said, here and here and here. Each of these buildings runs back a great distance from its doorway, something on the order of 35 metres, longer than you would think a sleeping place needs to be, and at the front of each, facing onto the street, there is an open colonnaded porch with a low roof held up on wooden posts, a shaded threshold where a man might sit in the cool of the evening with his back against the mud brick and watch the light go down. Behind the porch the building opens into its long main room, and running the whole length of it is a low raised platform of packed earth, a broad firm bench built up out of the floor and beaten hard. And it is on that platform, we believe, that the men slept, laid out along it side by side, like loaves on a board, like sailors in the low deck of a ship. And right at the back there is a small separate room or two, partitioned off, most likely the quarters of the man in charge, the foreman who slept a little apart because it was his to count the others and answer for them. When Lena and his people worked out how many that platform could hold, they came to a reckoning, offered as an estimate and not as gospel, of something on the order of 40 men to a gallery, and there was not one gallery but many, ranged in their comb tooth blocks, so that the number housed here all at once runs well over 1,000, and perhaps, when the place was fullest, closer to 2,000, laid down together on a single night under the same desert stars. And here is the first place where the old story of the whip begins, very softly to come apart, and it comes apart almost with a shrug, because the point is so plain once it is spoken, this is not how you keep slaves. A people who mean to drive others with the lash do not build them porches. They do not lay them long smooth sleeping platforms and roof them over and set them out on a careful plan with a shaded threshold to rest in at evening. Slaves driven by the lash are penned, they are not housed. You put them wherever they will keep till morning, and you spend nothing on their comfort, because their comfort was never the point. But this is architecture, this is design, this is provision, laid out with a plan, and what a plan like that tells you, before you have found a single loaf of bread, is that someone up above these men cared very much to know exactly how many of them there were, and where each would sleep, and meant to keep them ordered, and sheltered, and well. You do not draw a careful plan for people you intend to use up. The very tidiness of the galleries is the fingerprint of an organisation, of a state that counted, and that is a strange and warm thing to find at the bottom of a story you were always told was about cruelty, and we have only just walked in the door. Now let us step back out into the lane and follow our noses, because the next building announces itself before you reach it, and it is here, in and around the ovens, that the old tale of misery comes most completely apart, not in argument, but in sheer abundance. For scattered through this town the diggers found bakeries, and not one bakery but dozens, room after room of them, and you know them the moment you uncover them, because the earth in them is black, black with the deep-worked-in blackness of a floor that has held fire day after day for years, so that to kneel in one and brush the surface is to bring up on your fingers the char of bread that was. Made 45 centuries ago, in these black rooms the diggers found the working parts of the baking laid out plainly, the great vats for mixing dough in bulk, far beyond what one family could ever want, and, everywhere, in numbers that stagger, the bread pots. Hold one of these in your mind, because it is such a homely, graspable thing. The Egyptians called it, near enough, the bedja, a pot made for one purpose only, the baking of dense ration loaves, and it was a big thing, heavy, thick-walled, of coarse rough clay, shaped like a bell or a deep bucket with sloping sides, the size of a thing you would carry with both hands and set down with a grunt. And here is how it worked. You nested the bedja down into a bed of glowing embers to let the thick clay drink up the heat until it was fierce all through, then filled it with a great weight of dough, capped it with a second pot or a lid of clay, banked the coals close around the outside, and left it, while the dough within baked slowly in the shut warmth and rose to fill it and took the very shape of the bell that held it, coming out at last a heavy, close-grained, filling loaf. One pot, one loaf, and then again. One pot, one loaf. And the bedges were found not by the dozen, but by the thousand, broken and whole, heaped in great drifts of discarded clay, so many that they are less like the crockery of a kitchen, and more like the spent shells of some vast daily firing. And what they say, laid all together, is that the baking here was not a cottage craft, but something with no gentler word for it than infrastructure. Bread made the way a modern state makes electricity, in bulk, in shifts, on a schedule, the ovens never truly cooling. One gang of bakers relieving another, every day, and every day, a machine for the turning of grain into loaves at a scale to feed a small town of labouring men. Feel the warmth of that room as you lie there, the low red of the banked coals, the close smell of ash and baking and hot clay, the plain endless rhythm of one pot, one loaf, going on in the dark before dawn. It is, I think, a restful thing to hold, older than almost any rhythm we know, and yet so like the rhythms of any kitchen on any morning since. And now let us step next door, to the building that stood so often beside the bakery that the two are nearly one. Because in this world the bread and the drink were made side by side, and the breweries of the pyramid town are something rather wonderful. They are the accounting system of a whole kingdom, made solid, poured out in clay. Let me explain what I mean, because it undoes a great deal of the old picture all by itself. Old Kingdom Egypt, the Egypt that raised the Great Pyramid, had no coins. None. Money as we know it had not yet been invented, and would not be for something like 2,000 years after Khufu's pyramid was finished. So when a man gave his days and his strength to the king's great work, he could not be paid in money, because there was no money to pay him with. He was paid instead in the two staples that were the very floor of Egyptian life, and those two things were bread and beer. Bread and beer were the wage, the reckoning, the coin that was not a coin. A man's labour was set down and squared and paid in loaves and in jars, and it was all counted, all recorded, because the Egyptians were, above almost any people who ever lived, a nation of counters, and there were scribes whose whole work it was to reckon the rations, so that the feeding of the workforce was not a rough matter of throwing bread at the hungry, but an ordered payroll made of bread. And the standard daily ration ran to several of those dense loaves, and something on the order of 4 or 5 litres of beer, which sounds, in the modern dark, like a scandal, a whole workforce set to move 15-ton stones while pleasantly drunk. And I would gently correct that smile before it settles, because the beer of ancient Egypt was not the beer you are thinking of. It was thick and soupy and low in strength, more like a loose bread porridge than anything you would call a drink today, a cloudy, grainy filling brew that you half drank and half ate, and it mattered enormously, because it did two things the working body could not do without. It fed him, for it was dense with the goodness of the grain, real calories a labouring man could spend all day out on the hot stone, and it watered him safely, for the water of the river and the ditches could carry sickness, but the beer, brewed and soured from boiled and worked grain, was safer than the water in a world where clean things to drink were not to be taken for granted. So the 4 or 5 litres were not a debauch, they were dinner and safe water and wages, all at once. And you find the breweries as you find the bakeries, in their scale and repetition, the vats for mashing and fermenting, the twin machine standing beside the first, bread on one hand and beer on the other, the loaves and the jars going out together down the lanes at the end of the shift into the hands of tired men. And that is already a very long way from the whip. But the bakeries and the breweries are still the grand and organised evidence, the built and deliberate part of the town. And I find myself drawn on past them toward something humbler and more honest than any oven, toward the plainest evidence of all, the evidence that no one ever meant to leave for us, and no scribe ever wrote down. For it is one thing to read the buildings a people raised on purpose, and quite another and a truer thing to read what they threw away without a thought. Everything else a great building leaves behind is, in one way or another, trying to persuade you. The monument itself is a boast, raised to over a war, saying to the sky this is how great we were. The carved inscriptions are boasts too, arranged and flattering, telling you exactly what someone powerful wished you to believe. Even the papyrus we will come to is a document made by a person with a purpose, a scribe with a master. All of it is testimony given by a witness who knows they are being watched, and a witness who knows they are being watched will always, however honestly they mean to speak, arrange themselves a little. But a rubbish heap knows nothing of any of that. A midden is not trying to impress you, it was never meant to be read at all. It is simply the place where, day after ordinary day, people threw the things they were done with, the bones they had gnawed clean, and the ash they had raked out, without a single thought for what anyone 4,000 years later might make of the pile. and that is exactly why it is the most honest witness on the whole plateau. The monument tells you what the king wanted, the midden tells you what the workman had for supper. And of the two, if you truly want to know how a man was treated, it is the supper that tells you. Every time. So let us crouch down at the edge of one of the great deposits of kitchen waste the excavators found layered through the town, dark and greasy and rich, the compacted refuse of years of feeding a multitude, and see what is in it. And the first thing, in quantities genuinely difficult to hold in the mind, is fish. Fish bones, not a scatter, but by the countless thousand. The small, hard, durable bones of them worked all through the deposits like seeds through a loaf, and chief among them the bones of the Nile catfish, that great whiskered fish of the river the Egyptians knew as well as we know bread. Out on the Nile, in the season when the fish ran thick, the netsmen worked the shallows and hauled in the catfish by the basketful, more than could be eaten fresh, and so the surplus was split and gutted and dried in the hard clean sun or salted down, and carried up to the town in loads, and cooked, and eaten by the trayload, day upon day. A starving slave gang is not provisioned with tons of good river fish. But the fish is only where the reading begins, and it is not the part that undoes the old story. For beyond it, work through those same dark layers, are the bones of the beasts, cattle, sheep, goats, and here I must slow right down, because this is the quiet heart of the whole matter. When the specialists came, the patient people whose whole craft is the reading of old bones, and they sorted and identified and weighed, and did the long arithmetic of turning a heap of bone into a quantity of meat, the number they arrived at was staggering. There was enough butchered animal in that town to imply meat, real meat, for thousands of meals every single day. Not meat on a feast day, not meat as the rare treat of a holy occasion. Meat, in quantity, day in and day out, as the ordinary provisioning of an ordinary working week. And here is the detail within the detail, the small fact that turns the whole picture over as gently as a hand turning a stone in the dark. The cattle bones were not the tough, old, worn-out beasts at the end of their working lives, not the scrag ends a rich man's table would send down to the poor. They were, in great measure, the bones of young cattle, prime beef cattle, animals in the very best of their condition, the choicest meat a herd can give, the beef a wealthy household would have been proud to serve an honoured guest. The best of the herd, brought to the workers of the pyramid. And where did such cattle come from, in such numbers, on the edge of the desert where no great herd could graze? They were driven in, on the hoof, from the green cattle country of the delta, walked across the land alive to the foot of the plateau, and it appears the state had made provision for exactly this, had set aside whole estates whose entire reason for being was to raise cattle and grow grain and send them to feed the great work. And now let all of it settle together, the fish and the beef and the bakeries and the breweries, into a single plain sentence, and let that sentence lie in the dark between us without hurrying past it. Slaves are not fed prime beef. Say it over softly to yourself as you lie there. A workforce held by force and driven by the whip is fed the very least its masters can contrive to keep it working. That is the whole grim logic of owning a person, to take the most and give the least. You do not drive young cattle across a country on the hoof to feed people you despise. You do not build dedicated bakeries and breweries. You do not net the river by the ton. You do not found whole estates in the delta in order to lavish it all upon men you regard as tools. The honest testimony of the rubbish heap says something the old story of the lash simply cannot survive, that these men were fed, and fed well, and fed deliberately, at enormous and sustained expense to the state. Somebody far up in the ordered world of that kingdom valued these workers, valued them enough to build an entire machine of provision around them and keep it turning year after year. That is not how you treat the despised. That is how you treat the valued. And the bones, who are flattering no one, tell us so plainly. So if not slaves, then who? Who were they? These well-fed men in their long comb-tooth galleries, and how many of them were there? Here we must gently set aside the oldest and most famous answer, the number you have very likely heard. 100,000 men toiling at once, for that comes down to us from Herodotus, who wrote it some 2,000 years after the pyramid was already built. His 100,000 is not a witness's count, it is a legend's round number, a way of saying an unthinkable many, and we may lay it down gently. What do the people who have actually dug in the sand tell us? The careful modern reckoning, working outward from the town and the galleries and the food and the graves, is very much smaller and very much more human. Perhaps 20,000 people, perhaps 30,000 at the very peak of the work. And crucially, not all of them at Giza. That number is the whole enterprise spread across the whole land, and most of those people were not on the hill at all. They were in the limestone quarries nearby and the granite quarries far south at Aswan. They were in the boatyards, they were crewing the barges, they were on the estates raising the cattle and the grain. They were strung all along the supply lines. The men actually at the stones were a fraction of the whole. And that fraction came in two kinds, and the difference between them is the difference that finally lays the ghost of slavery to rest. First, there was a permanent corps, a skilled, settled, professional corps of perhaps a few thousand souls who lived at Giza more or less the year round, and did this superbly. The master masons who knew stone the way a musician knows an instrument. The tool makers who kept the copper chisels sharp. The surveyors who kept the whole vast thing square and true and level to a precision that still astonishes the foremen and the bakers and brewers and butchers and potters and water carriers who kept the town running. These were professionals, people with a craft and a rank and a place, and it is very largely these whom we find honoured in the little cemeteries beside the town. And then, around that steady core, washing in and out with the turning of the year like a great slow tide, came the others, the rotating crews of ordinary farmers. This is the loveliest and most human part of the whole arrangement, and it turns entirely upon the river. For the Nile, in that age, was not a steady thing between fixed banks. The Nile breathed. Once a year it rose, swollen with the far-off summer rains of the African highlands, and spilled out over its whole broad valley, and drowned the fields under a sheet of life giving water and silt, and this season the Egyptians called Akhet, and it lasted some 3 months, and during those 3 months there was, quite simply, no farming to be done. The fields were under water. And so across the whole valley. There were tens of thousands of peasant farmers with 3 months on their hands and nothing agricultural to fill them, and it was these men, we believe in their village bands, who floated downstream on the high water to serve their rotation on the great work. They came for a season. They were housed in the long galleries, 40 to a gallery. They were fed from the dedicated bakeries and breweries, given their good bread and their thick nourishing beer and their share of the fish and the beef. They were set to the ropes and the ramps and the sledges under the direction of the skilled corps. And then, when the water began to fall and the fields began to rise again, and it was time to go home and plant, they were paid in bread and beer and the reckoned rations of a working man, and sent back upriver to their families and their farms, and a fresh crew floated down to take their place. Do you see the shape of it? The thing that raised the Great Pyramid was never the whip. It was logistics of a brilliance that ought to take the breath away far more than any legend of cruelty. It was grain grown on state estates and moved by barge, cattle raised in the delta and driven in on the hoof, fish netted and dried by the ton, scribes with reed pens counting the loaves and the man days, tracking who had served and who was owed. It was the entire agricultural rhythm of a whole kingdom taken up and turned like an enormous wheel, so that the one dead season of the farming year, the 3 idle months when the flood lay upon the land, was harnessed and spun and made to lift stone, the country's slack time converted, through sheer administrative genius, into the slow upward growth of a mountain of dressed limestone. That is the real marvel of it. Not that a tyrant found enough backs to break, but that a state found a way to feed and house and organise and pay a rotating army of seasonal hands so smoothly for so many years that the stone rose and rose. And now I must slow down and say the honest thing, the thing that keeps us from swinging too far the other way. It would be just as false to paint these farmers as cheerful volunteers turning up out of pure love. This ran, in all likelihood, on what later ages would call the corve, a labour tax, an obligation owed to the crown, a duty of work that a subject rendered to the state much as, in other times, he rendered a portion of his grain. A man summoned to his rotation may well have had little real choice in the going. When the state that governs your whole world calls you to your season of service, you go, whether gladly or grumbling. So let us say it plainly and fairly, these men were in some measure conscripted, summoned, but hold the two words side by side in the dark, and feel the great distance between them. Conscripted is not enslaved. To be called to a season of service, and then paid for it, and housed for it, and fed better than you ate at home, and tended by physicians if the stone should injure you, and sent home again to your own fields when your turn was done, and, should you die, buried with honour in the good ground beside the monument, with your tools laid beside you, that is the condition of a subject who owes the state his labour. It is not the condition of a thing the state owns. There is a world of difference between the man who must go and the man who may never leave, between the one who is summoned, worked, paid, and released, and the one who is bought, driven, spent, and discarded. The pyramid was built by the first kind of man. And where is the honest edge of all this, the place where even the rubbish heap falls silent? It is here. The midden can tell us these men were well fed, the graves can tell us they were doctored and honoured, the galleries can tell us they were housed with care, the scribes' accounts can tell us they were reckoned and paid, but none of it can tell us the one thing we most want to know, which is how it felt, on the inside, to be one of these men, whether the farmer on his rotation heaved on the rope with pride swelling in his chest, or whether he heaved with his eyes on the falling water and his mind already home in his village, merely enduring his season and counting the days. That, the inside of the heart, is where the evidence truly runs out, and I will not pretend to you that it does not. So let us leave the question open and gentle, and come back down into the town as the light is going. The sun is going down over the western desert behind the rising pyramid, and the light has turned that deep late copper gold that lies so softly on mud brick walls, pouring now along the lanes. The crews are coming down off the hill, dusty and tired and loose-limbed, with the good tiredness of heavy work laid down for the day, and the smoke of the cook fires is rising all through the town, blue and thin and fragrant with roasting fish and baking bread, hanging low over the rooftops in the still evening air. Along the lanes the beer jars are going round, and there is the low murmur of hundreds of voices, the talk and the laughter and the easy grumbling of working men at the end of a working day, in a language long gone from the world but no stranger, in its music, than the talk in any tired crew anywhere. And in the long galleries, in the gathering dusk, the farmers are lying down, 40 to a gallery, side by side on the raised earthen platform, some already asleep, some talking low into the dark, some just easing the ache out of their shoulders. And above them all, above the smoking rooftops and the darkening lanes, the unfinished pyramid stands against the last of the copper light, its stepped and rising courses catching the glow and holding it, glowing there over the whole sleeping town like a great hearth over a household, watching over the men who are raising it as they lie down to sleep in its shadow. And that, very nearly, is the whole of what the town can tell us. It can tell us they ate well and slept in order and were paid and were honoured. But it cannot tell us the last thing, the innermost thing, whether the man lying down in that gallery was proud, or whether he was only enduring. And for even the faintest whisper of an answer to that, we cannot stay down here among the ovens and the beer jars. We have to leave the town. We have to go up onto the plateau in the dark, and into the great monument itself, and climb, up through its narrow ascending passages into the heart of all that weight of stone, all the way up to a low and secret space that no visitor was ever meant to see. a sealed crawl space hidden high above the king's chamber, closed on the day it was made, and never meant to be opened again, because it turns out that the men who built this thing did leave us one word about how they felt. They left it in the last place anyone would ever look. And we are going to climb up, slowly, and read it. And so we leave the town behind us, the cook smoke and the beer jars and the 40 tired farmers lying down along the floor of their gallery, and we turn our backs on all that warm and ordinary life, because there is one question the town can never answer, and it is, in the end, the only one that truly matters. Not how these men were fed, nor how they were housed, nor how the whole vast machine of grain and barge and rope was turned to keep them at their work. We have sat with all of that, gently, but it cannot tell us how they felt. Whether the men who raised this mountain climbed to the work each morning proud, or merely enduring, whether there was something in it for the heart, or only for the aching back, and that is a thing a rubbish heap can never say. For that answer, if there is one to be had, we have to climb, up into the monument itself, to a handful of low and secret rooms sealed away above the chamber where the king himself was meant to lie, rooms that no living person was ever meant to enter. And this climb is not like other climbs, for it is not truly a journey across distance at all. It is a journey into density. When you go up inside the Great Pyramid, you do not feel, as you would on a hillside, that you are rising into the light. You feel with every single step that you are going deeper, further inside a mass so great that the mind slides off the edge of it, with more and more stone gathering quietly above your head the higher you go. We are not climbing a hill tonight. We are climbing into the middle of a small mountain that men made with their hands, and every step upward takes us further in. We come in through a low mouth on the northern face, and at once the world narrows. The passage was not made for a person to walk along. It was made for the pyramid's own reasons, and a person is only just tolerated within it. You must bend, and then bend further, until you are moving bent nearly double, your back gone almost level, shuffling upward along a smooth, straight ascending shaft so low that your shoulders brush the walls to either side, and the air changes as you go. Down at the mouth there is still something of the night breeze, but a little way in that is gone, and the air becomes warm, and still, and close, an air that has not truly stirred in a very long time, carrying the faint chalk and mineral smell of old limestone, and the deep silence of a place where no wind has ever reached. And all the while, though you cannot see it, you can feel it gathering above you, the weight. Above the low ceiling brushing your bent back there is stone, and above that more stone, course upon course, climbing away into the blackness. More than 2 million blocks, some 6 million tons of limestone and granite gathered into one single mountain-shaped mass, and you are threading a passage no wider than your own shoulders straight up through the middle of the whole of it. Let me give you that number gently, only once. 6 million tons. It does nothing in the head, it is only a smear of zeros, so feel it instead, a weight past all the lorries on all the roads you have ever watched go by, past herds and herds of elephants beyond any counting, a mountain, and you are inside it, in the warm and windless dark, going up. And then, quite suddenly, in the very middle of all that bent and shuffling smallness, the stone above you lifts away, and you can stand. You can straighten your back for the first time and lift your head, and your lamp gropes upward into a great tall space and cannot find the top of it, for you have come out into the strangest and I think the most beautiful place in the whole hidden interior. A long, steep, soaring hall that climbs away ahead of you into the dark, rising on either hand far higher than a house. This is the Grand Gallery. It goes up nearly 9 meters over your head, and it is built in a way that makes you catch your breath once you understand it. For the 2 long walls do not rise straight, they rise in steps, each course set to overhang the one just beneath it by a hand's breadth. 7 great corbelled steps leaning slowly in from either side as they climb, so that the walls seem to lean together far above you and very nearly meet in the dark. It is like standing at the foot of the nave of a cathedral with no windows and no candles and no congregation, buried whole in the heart of a mountain, its high stone vault holding its silence as it has held it for 4,500 years. And you climb it, up the long steep floor toward the deeper dark at its head, and there the way narrows once more, and once more you must stoop low through a short cramped passage, and then you step through, and you straighten, and you are standing in the room that was the whole point of it all, the king's chamber. And here is the strange thing. It is plain. After the vast leaning drama of the gallery you expect wonders, gold, colour, carving, a riot of painted gods, and there is none of it. The king's chamber is a plain and perfect box of a room, walls and floor and ceiling all of polished red granite, dark and smooth and bare, without a single carved figure or painted line anywhere upon it, holding at one end only a single lidless box of granite, the coffer, hewn from one solid block. And the plainness is not poverty. The plainness is the point. It is the calm at the centre of the storm of stone, a room made not to dazzle but to endure, cut and fitted with a precision that would satisfy an engineer today. Its great granite blocks brought the whole length of Egypt, hundreds of miles down the river from the quarries at Aswan, for no reason anyone can name, except that granite was the hardest and most honoured stone they had, and this room was to be given the best. And lift your eyes to the ceiling, because the ceiling is the quiet marvel of it. It is simply flat, a flat stone lid laid straight across the top, and it is made of 9 enormous beams of granite, laid side by side, each one weighing something on the order of 50 tons. 50 tons apiece. Each single stone of that flat ceiling weighs about what a dozen elephants would weigh, and there are 9 of them, laid up there overhead, quarried and floated down the Nile, and hauled up into the growing pyramid, while the whole mountain of masonry rose on around and above them. And for thousands of years that flat granite ceiling was thought to be the end, the top of the inside of the pyramid, the last and highest place. Except that it did not end there, because the room does not end at its ceiling. Above those 9 great beams, above what everyone took for the roof of everything, there is more. Stacked one upon another over the king's chamber, hidden in the solid body of the pyramid, sealed inside the mass with no door and no passage leading to them, are 5 more rooms. 5 low hidden chambers, piled up over the ceiling of the first, each one a flat lid of granite beams with a narrow airless gap above it, and then, crowning the topmost, not a flat lid at all, but a great pointed roof of granite. 2 vast slabs leaned together like the palms of 2 hands, set fingertip to fingertip in prayer. And here is the tender, astonishing thing about them. They were not built for anyone. No one was ever meant to stand in them. They are not tombs, not shrines, not treasuries. They are so low that in most of them you could not even sit upright. And their floors were left rough. They were built for one reason only, a reason of pure sober engineering, and it is this: to carry the weight. For above the king's chamber rises some 200 vertical feet of solid pyramid, an unthinkable dead load pressing straight down, and a flat stone ceiling, however thick, will in time crack and sag and fail under a burden like that. So the builders, who had no formula for it that we know of, understood the danger in their bones and answered it with these hidden rooms, 5 empty spaces to divide the crushing weight into layers, to catch it and share it a little at a time, and above them all that leaning stone roof to split the great load and shrug it down and outward into the flanks of the pyramid, away from the fragile flat span below. It is one of the oldest pieces of structural engineering on the face of the earth, and it worked. The king's chamber has stood, unbowed, for 45 centuries, held up by 5 empty rooms that were sealed on the very day their roofs were closed and were never meant to be opened again. Rooms built with enormous labour precisely in order to be forgotten, doing their patient, invisible work of bearing the mountain for as long as the mountain should stand. And they held their silence a very long time, but not forever. The lowest of the 5 had been stumbled upon first long before, in the year 1765, by an Englishman named Nathaniel Davison, who climbed to the top of the Grand Gallery and noticed, up in a high corner, a small dark gap in the stone, and, holding up his candle, saw the flame lean and flicker, drawn sideways by a faint breath of air coming out of the crevice. Air, where there should be only solid stone. So he crawled in through the gap, and there above the king's chamber he found the first of the hidden rooms, low and black and empty, and it bears his name to this day. And there the matter rested. But some 70 years later, in the 1830s, there came to Giza a man of a very different temper, a British Army officer named Colonel Richard William Howard Vyse, and Vyse suspected rightly that there might be more spaces yet above it. And here I must simply say the plain thing and set it down gently. Where a patient man might have probed, and tapped, and sounded the stone for a seam, the colonel blasted. He drove his way upward with gunpowder and chisels, forcing his way from the one chamber to the next above it and the next, tearing a rough scar straight up through the body of the pyramid that is still there today. And it is hard from here not to wince at it a little, at the black powder and the broken blocks, at the violence done to a thing that had kept itself so perfectly for so long. Let the regret be said, and truly felt, and then let it be set down softly, because for all its roughness that forcing of the way ended in one of the quietest and most beautiful discoveries in all of Egypt. For as the colonel's men broke through into each of those 4 higher rooms in turn, and lifted a lamp into spaces that had been shut and dead still since the reign of Khufu himself, the light fell upon the rough granite of the walls, and the stone was not blank, it was marked. All across the undersides of the beams and the rough faces of the blocks, laid on in broad, careless, confident strokes of red-brown paint, of ochre, was writing, not the neat carved hieroglyphs of priests, not the formal proclamations of a king, but something far homelier and more human, the working scribbles of the men who had built the place. There were levelling lines, long red guide strokes marking how the courses should sit. There were setting marks, and little notes to show which way a block should face, the ordinary jottings of a building site, the marks a mason makes to get the stone in the right place and then never thinks of again. And among all those workaday daubs were names. Gang names. The names the work crews had given themselves, splashed up on the blocks the way a modern building crew might chalk their name across a steel beam before it is craned up and swallowed into a tower. And the most famous of them, painted in the topmost of those hidden chambers, reads, near enough as we can render it across the great gulf of the language, the Friends of Khufu. Or some would say the Companions of Khufu, the gang that called itself by the king's own name, and claimed his friendship as its badge. And I should be honest at the edges of that, and tell you that the reading wobbles a little in the hands of the scholars, that the exact sense of these old crew names is argued over, that friends and companions and 1 or 2 other shades are all in the running. But the shape of the thing is not in doubt at all. These are the men. This is a work gang, signing its name. And now dwell on where they signed it, because the where of it is the whole heart of what I climbed all this way to show you. They did not sign it out on the great gleaming casing, where the whole of Egypt might crane up and read it. They did not sign it along the passages, where priests and pilgrims of later ages might one day pass with their lamps. They painted their names on the rough backs of blocks that were about to be sealed away forever, in low airless rooms that were being closed off from the world at that very moment as the courses rose over them, made into rooms that, by everything those men themselves believed, no living human eye would ever look upon again. Only the gods would read that wall. That is who they were painting for. And so draw the conclusion with me, softly, because it draws itself. There is no whip in all the world that produces that signature. You do not force a frightened, driven, resentful man to daub his crew's proud name on a stone about to vanish forever into the belly of a mountain where no overseer will ever check it, and it can win him nothing at all. There is nothing in it for him. You sign a thing like that, in a place like that, for one reason only, across all the thousands of years between us, because you are proud of the work, because it is yours, and you made it, and you want it said, even if the only one left to read it is a god. And let me give you one more gentle secret to carry off towards sleep, for it belongs to those same red daubs. Khufu, the king himself, the pharaoh for whom the whole apparatus of the town and the crews and the barges and the 6 million tons was set turning, Khufu's own name survives inside the entire Great Pyramid, in all its millions of blocks, essentially only here. Only in these rough, hasty red workman's scrawls, high up in the sealed rooms no one was meant to enter. There is no grand inscription of him within, no carved and gilded royal name over any door. The mightiest single monument the human race has ever raised carries its own maker's name. On the inside, nowhere but in the offhand handwriting of his labourers, his cartouche splashed among the setting marks, some of it sideways, some upside down, some half swallowed, where 2 blocks were pushed together and the joint closed over the paint, so that you can tell it was daubed on before the stone was ever set in place. The name of the king, kept for the ages not by priests, but by the crews, in red ochre, tucked into the joints. I find that almost unbearably tender, that the vast cold geometry of the thing should hold, at its hidden heart, only the warm, careless handwriting of the men who lifted it. And there is one more, from across the plateau, that I cannot leave out because it has made me smile for years. Over at the Pyramid of Menkaure, the smaller of the 3, the grandson's tomb, the archaeologists found another gang's name daubed in the same old way, and this crew had called itself, near enough, the Drunkards of Menkaure, the Drunkards. Or, if you would be kinder to them, and the translation will happily bear the kinder reading too, something more like those whom Menkaure keeps well supplied, a crew boasting, with a wink, that their king kept the beer flowing. Either way, it is a joke. It is workplace banter, a crew grinning at their own name, laughing at themselves and at their first 4,500 years ago, on a building site under the same sun, and that little joke has quietly outlived every empire that has risen and fallen since, has outlasted Egypt itself, and Rome, and all of it, and it is still here, still faintly funny, still human, resting in the stone. And so these painted names turn out to be a great deal more than charming. Look at them again, the crew, the gang, the friends of Khufu, the drunkards of Menkaure, the levelling lines, the whole red scatter of it, and you begin to see that it is not just graffiti at all. It is a chart. It is the organisational chart of the entire project, the whole shape of how tens of thousands of people were sorted and named and set to work, written out in ochre in the one place on earth where no one would ever trouble to fake it. And that chart we can walk down, one gentle step at a time, like a staircase in the dark, and that is exactly where we shall go next. An organisational chart, then, is what those red-painted names amount to, and we shall walk it, one step at a time, the way you might go down a wide, shallow staircase in the dark, with your hand resting light upon the rail, because there is no hurry in it, and because the numbers themselves, I have found, are restful when you take them slowly. And what we are really doing is watching a great crowd of people sort itself, without confusion, without panic, without anyone being lost, into smaller and warmer circles, until we arrive, at the very bottom, at a single man on a single rope among 9 others he knows by name. Begin at the top, at the widest part, with the largest unit the Egyptians used, which we call, in plain English, a crew. A crew was a great body of workers, something on the order of 2,000 men, gathered under a single name and a single purpose, a small town's worth of backs and hands and appetites, all reckoned as one thing, one crew, assigned to one great work. And here is the first kindness of the system, the first thing they did that we would recognise as wisdom. They did not leave 2,000 men as a shapeless multitude, a crowd in which a person could vanish. They halved it. Each crew was divided into 2 gangs of roughly 1,000 men apiece, and the gangs were not numbered coldly, Gang 1 and Gang 2, they were given names. And the names, when we read them off the stone, are the most wonderfully human thing, because they swagger, they boast, they have their chests out. A gang might call itself the Friends of Khufu, taking the pharaoh's own great name and wrapping it about themselves like a banner. We are his. We are the ones close to him. And down the plateau another called itself the Drunkards of Menkore, laughing at itself and at its king in the same breath. These were not sombre labels handed down from an office. These were the names men give themselves when they are proud of who they run with, and you painted your gang's name on the blocks your gang had set, in red, so that everyone would know whose work this was. And the two gangs of a crew were not simply set side by side to share the labour quietly. They were, as far as we can tell, set deliberately against one another, in rivalry, put to work on opposite sides of the same monument. This gang raising the northern face and that gang the southern, and then, in effect, invited to race. 2,000 men in two named teams, told to go and see who could do more, who could set their courses faster and cleaner and higher, who could stand at the beer jars in the evening and say, truthfully, that their side had outdone the other that day. I find that a marvellous piece of understanding of the human animal, and we will come back to it. But for now only notice how 1,000 men who might have been an anonymous half of a faceless crowd become, the moment you give them a name and a rival, a team with something to prove, and how much more gladly a man will pull on a rope for the honour of his side than he ever would for a whip at his back. So that is the second step down the staircase, the crew halved into two named and rivalrous gangs, and now we go down again, because each gang of 1,000 was itself divided into 5 parts, and these 5 parts we call files. And I owe you a word about that word, for it is a borrowed one. File is Greek, meaning a tribe, a division of people, and the scholars who first studied these matters reached for it because it was familiar, and so it stuck. But the word the Egyptians themselves used was their own word for a watch of a boat's crew, the shift of rowers who take the oars together while another shift rests, and I hope you feel the quiet beauty of that, because it carries us back down into the water, to the truth that these builders thought of themselves, in the very words they used to sort themselves, as a crew, as men of the oar and the sail, so that even on dry land hauling stone they organised their labour in the language of the river, as though the whole pyramid were a great ship rowed slowly up out of the sand. 5 watches then, 5 files to a gang, perhaps 200 men in each, and the 5 had names, and here I will give them to you softly, one after another, the way you might tell over 5 smooth stones in your palm, the great, the first of them, and the Asiatic, and the green, and the little, and the last one, my favourite, the perfect. The great, the Asiatic, the green, the little, and the perfect. Say them over to yourself if you like, and do not trouble too much about what each was meant to signify, for the honest truth is that we are not entirely certain. The exact sense has worn away, and it does not matter tonight. What matters is only that a man of that gang knew which of the 5 he was, and wore that knowing as part of who he was. And still we are not at the bottom, for the file of 200 was divided once more, into small teams, little bands of only 10 or 20 men. And even these, even the smallest cell of the whole vast body, even a huddle of 10 men on one rope, were given names of their own, single words daubed on the stone, and the names that survive are the sort of words a person would be glad to have over him. One team called itself life, simply that. Another called itself endurance, the very quality a man hauling stone would pray for, and another, again, the perfect. Life and endurance and perfection, painted small on the blocks by the smallest teams. And there, at last, we have come all the way down the staircase, from the crew of 2,000, through the gang of 1,000 with its proud name and its rival, through the file of 200, down to the team of 10. And I want to stop on the bottom step and turn and put a single human face to all this counting, because the counting was never the point, the counting was only the frame, and now let us hang the picture in it. Picture one ordinary man, not a hero, not a foreman, just one farmer among the tens of thousands, coming to Giza in the season of the flood, with the water lying brown and wide over his drowned fields behind him, because there is nothing to be done at home when the river is up, no ground to work, no crop to tend, only waiting, and so he has come, as men from his village have always come, to give his idle season and his strong back to the king's work. And here is the thing I most want you to feel. This man does not arrive to be swallowed. He does not walk up onto that plateau and dissolve into a faceless horde of 100,000 nameless souls, one more anonymous body driven and lost. That is the picture the old story painted, and it is wrong, and you can see it is wrong the moment you have walked the staircase. Because within a day, within perhaps an hour of his arriving, this man is not lost at all. He is assigned, and, far more than assigned, he belongs. He is given to a team of 10. 10 men, a number a person can hold, a number of faces you learn by the end of the first evening, 10 men who from that day will sleep in the same quarters as he does, and eat from the same bread and beer, and lay their hands on the very same rope, 10 men whose names he will know, and who will know his, so that when the great stone begins to move, it moves, because his 10 are pulling as one. And his 10 belongs to a file, so that he is not only a man of a team, but a man of the green, say, or of the little. And his file belongs to a gang with a name he can say with his chest out, the Friends of Khufu, and a reputation, and a rival across the monument it means to beat. And his gang belongs to a crew, and the crew is raising the northern face of the tallest thing that human beings had ever built or would build for thousands of years to come. And so this one ordinary farmer can stand at the foot of the rising pyramid on his first evening and look up and know, exactly and without confusion, where he fits. He can trace it in his mind, only upward, from himself. I am one of these 10. My 10 is endurance. Endurance is of the green is of the Friends of Khufu. The Friends of Khufu are raising the northern face. The northern face is half of the greatest thing in the world. His own small pull on his own rope is not lost in the whole. It has a place in the whole, a place he can name and feel and be proud of, and that, I think, is one of the deepest comforts a working life can give. To know that your labour is not a drop poured into a bucket and gone, but a thread woven into a cloth you can point to. There, that is mine. That stone sits where it sits because of me. And they kept the score of it, remember, in red on the stone, all up the courses of the pyramid. On the hidden faces of the blocks, the overseers and the teams left their tallies and their quotas. This many blocks set by this gang in this month. This course finished by the green. Red dabs and strokes and dates recording who did what and how much. And these marks, when the Egyptologists read them, do not read like the grim ledger of a slave master counting his forced quotas. They read, many of them, like boasting. They read like the marks men make when they are keeping score against the other side, when they want it set down and undeniable that their gang set more blocks this month than the rival gang did. You can almost hear it, the sound of it in the evening when the work has stopped, and the light has gone long and gold, and the men are sitting with the beer jars, the two gangs going at each other, the friendly ferocious boasting. We set more than you today, but you started higher up. We will have the whole course capped before you land your next block, and the laughing, and the score being kept and argued and painted up on the stones for the morning. That is the sound of the building of the Great Pyramid, I have come to think, not the crack of a whip and the groan of the driven, but the boasting of rival teams at the beer jars in the cool of the evening. And so we arrive at the idea I most want to leave with you, the one to carry down into sleep. We keep asking what the machine of Giza was. What engine could possibly have moved 6 million tons of stone in the lifetime of one king? And we go looking for it in the wrong place, in metal and mechanism, in some lost technology of bronze or of iron. And I have to tell you, softly, that they had no such thing. No bronze worth the name for such a task, and iron still centuries away over the horizon. No machine in the sense we mean the word at all. The machine of Giza was not made of metal. The machine of Giza was made of people. It was a machine of belonging. That was the engine, and it is not hidden in any sealed chamber. It is painted openly in red on the sides of the stones, teams nested inside teams, tens inside 200s inside thousands, each small circle whole and named and warm. Each fitting inside the next without losing itself. The way the cells of a living body sit inside its tissues and its limbs and the one body, all of it separate and all of it one, and running through the whole of it like a pulse, was pride and its close companion rivalry, the wish to have your name on the stone and your tally ahead of the other sides. That was what moved the stones. Not only the ramps and the sledges and the ropes and the water, though there were all of those, but this quiet genius of dividing 100,000 strangers into 10-man families and setting family against family in glad competition moved the stones as surely as any ramp ever did. And a named team carries a man. That is a thing to sit with as you drift, because it is as true this night as it was on that plateau. To be told your labour has a name, that you are a member of Endurance, of the Green, of the Friends of the King, one of a band with a reputation to keep and a rival to beat, is to be carried, on the days when your own strength would fail, by the strength of belonging. Bronze rusts and iron rots, but the pride of a named team, the fierce glad loyalty of 10 men to one another, outlasts all of it, and it is the same in us tonight as it was in them, and it built a mountain. So let that be the thing you hold, the machine that was not made of metal but of belonging, and let it settle. And now, because we have been a long while up here in the close warm dark among the red-painted names, let us go back down and out. Let us leave the high hidden chambers where the gangs signed their work for the gods, and come back down the great steep hall of the Grand Gallery, feeling our way down its long polished slope, down through the warm still weight of the whole mountain, and into the low-bent passage that runs out toward the north face, stooping again, the air cooling and freshening and moving at last, until we come out through the low mouth into the open night, into the enormous cool of the desert dark, and the great wheel of the stars over Giza, and the sudden blessed room to stand upright and breathe. And we will not go in again tonight. The story has one more place it wants to take us before you sleep, and it lies out here, under the stars, away from the great stone faces, out across the sand to the south. And it is, I think, the tenderest place of them all. A low and humble field of the ground that a horse's hoof first opened to us one ordinary day, and it is there that we shall walk together next. And so we go out under the stars, you and I, out from the cold breath of the passage into the wide soft night, and we turn our backs on the great pale face of the pyramid and walk south across the sand, slowly, in no hurry at all, our feet going down into that fine drifted coolness that the day's heat has long since gone out of, and the whole plateau lies quiet around us, silvered a little where the moon touches it, and there is nothing to fear in any of it, only the soft hiss of the sand against our ankles and the long low ridge of the desert rolling away toward a place that almost nobody thinks to visit, a place with no golden treasure in it and no painted kings, a place that was found, of all the ways a thing can be found, by a horse. This is the ground the stumbling horse first opened, one evening in the spring of 1990, when a tired hoof came down, not on sand or stone, but on the buried top of a low mud brick wall, and that small blind stumble broke open the last and tenderest piece of the whole long quiet case, the thing that, more than the bread ovens, more than the fish bones, more than the red-painted names, finally lays the old story of the whipped and dying slave to its rest. For under the sand, spread out across the slope once the archaeologists came and lifted the desert gently away, were graves. Thousands of them. The graves of the workers, the cemetery of the very people who built the pyramids, laid out in sight of the monuments they had raised, sleeping where they had chosen to sleep. And it is here that I want to spend this last quiet hour with you, walking softly among them, because there is nothing in all of Egypt that undoes the myth so completely and so kindly as the way these ordinary people were buried. They are not grand. I want to say that plainly first, because the tenderness of this place is not the tenderness of gold. These are poor people's graves, and they look it, made of what there was, of mud brick shaped by hand and dried in the sun, and patched out with whatever the great works up the hill had left lying about, the scraps and offcuts and ends of things, a broken piece of granite meant for something finer, an odd wedge of limestone with one dressed face and one rough one, the leavings, the stone that was not quite good enough for a king, carried down the slope by people who were themselves not quite good enough, in the reckoning of the world, for anything better than the leavings. And you might think, hearing that what you would find here is a sad and careless scatter, a heaping of the dead into the ground the way the poor are so often heaped, hurriedly, meanly. But that is not what is here at all, and this is the first small wonder of the place. Because these graves, built of mud and scraps though they are not careless heaps. They are made things. Somebody cared how they looked. Somebody built them with an idea in mind, and the idea is the most touching thing about them. Some of them are little domes, small rounded beehives of mud brick swelling up out of the sand, neat and deliberate. And many of the others, and here is where I find my breath goes a little short, are tiny copies, faithful little toy copies, of the great tombs of the mighty. For the princes and nobles of Egypt were buried in what are called mastabas, great flat-topped rectangular tombs of dressed stone, long low houses for the dead with their sloping sides and sealed chambers and courtyards, the grand and expensive architecture of the important. And the workers down here in their poor cemetery, with their mud and their broken granite, built themselves mastabas too. Small ones, miniature ones, scaled down to what a labourer's family could raise with their own hands in a day or two, but faithful to the form, with their own small flat tops, their own little sloping walls, their own tiny courtyards, and, this is the detail I cannot get past, some of them with their own small ramps, little miniature ramps built up against the little tombs, the very ramps, in miniature, that they had spent their lives building against the mountain up the hill, the architecture of kings, borrowed at the scale of the poor. And why does that borrowing matter? Because it is not a small vanity, not merely the poor aping the rich it is, when you understand how these people saw the world, the whole of the point. For in Egypt, the shape of your tomb was the shape of your hope. The tomb was not a marker of where the body lay. It was the vehicle by which you crossed over and went on living in the next world. And a grand tomb of the proper shape, provisioned and sealed and set in the right place, was a passage secured, an eternity made ready. And so when these labourers took the very forms that were reserved, by every rule of rank and wealth, for the princes, and made them their own in brick and mud and broken stone, they were not decorating, they were hoping. They were laying claim with their own hands to the same eternity the great men claimed, reaching up out of their poverty toward exactly the kind of forever that the powerful had reserved for themselves. And here is the thing I want you to hold most gently of all. Nobody stopped them. Nobody came down from the great works and told them that the forms of kings were not for the likes of them. Nobody pulled down their little mastabas or moved their graves away to some meaner ground out of sight. The graves were allowed. They remain exactly where those people built them, in open view, in plain sight of the pyramids, arranged so, and this is deliberate, so that the dead lie for all eternity with the great monument standing there on their horizon, the last and largest thing in their sky forever. Because nearness itself was the treasure. To sleep for eternity in the shadow of the king's own mountain was believed to carry you along in his crossing, to let you ride, in some measure, on the current of his own guaranteed and God-made eternity. It was, quite literally, the most valuable piece of real estate in the cosmos, this ground beside the king, and the great nobles bought their places in it with a lifetime of rank and service, petitioning across whole careers for the privilege. And these men, these haulers and diggers and brickmakers, these people of the leavings, were granted it for a lifetime of work rather than a lifetime of rank. They were given a place in the same holy nearness, and they took it, and they lie there still. Now come closer, and look at what was set beside them in the ground, because the graves were not left bare. Beside the bodies were jars of bread and jars of beer, the same bread and beer we watched come out of those great bakeries up the hill, the daily wage of the plateau. The dead were provisioned, sent off with food and drink for the road, exactly as the nobles were, so that they would not go hungry or thirsty on the long crossing. And I find something almost unbearably gentle in the fact of it, that the very bread and beer these people were paid in for the moving of the stones was set beside them to be their provision in the next world, so that a man went into eternity supplied with the fruits of his own honest work. And on the little tombs, on the crude small false doors they built into their miniature mastabas, for the false door is the threshold through which the spirit of the dead comes and goes to receive its offerings, are words. Titles, and I want you to read them slowly with me, the way you would read a receipt, because that is what they are, the plainest possible statement of who these people understood themselves to be. Overseer of the side of the pyramid. Director of workers, inspector of the craftsmen. Overseer of masonry. Say them again, and let each one settle. Overseer of the side of the pyramid, a man in charge of one whole face of the rising mountain, and who wanted the world and the gods to know it forever. These are the words that ordinary men chose to have set over their graves for all eternity, and dwell, as you drift. On what a strange and beautiful choice that is. For a man's tomb text is the one message he sends past his own death. It is the thing he wants said of him when he can no longer say anything for himself, forever. And these men did not ask, in that one eternal message, for mercy. They did not carve a prayer for forgiveness, or a plea, or a lament. They did not leave the blank anonymous silence of the discarded. They carved their jobs. They carved the thing they did with their backs and their hands and their judgment across 30 and 40 years of working life. They carved their rank in the great work. Their competence, their pride, they said, in effect to the ages and to the gods, this is who I was. I was the man who oversaw the masonry, I ran the side of the pyramid, and they wanted no other words standing guard over their rest. That is not the epitaph of a slave. A slave does not title himself. A slave has no side of the pyramid that is his to oversee. Those are the words of people who did hard skilled work and knew it was hard and skilled, and were proud, and wanted the pride kept. Now let us turn, softly, and without any fright in it, to the bodies themselves, to the bones, because I promised you all through this night that I would not soften the truth, and I will not soften it here. The work was hard. The skeletons carry it in them, written into the very structure of them. Their spines show it, the vertebrae compressed and worn from years of carrying loads. Their joints show it, arthritis ground into the knees and hips and shoulders, where a body has pulled and lifted and hauled 10,000 days running. And it is there in the men and the women both, for women worked on that plateau too, and their bones carry the same honest wear. These were not soft lives, the stones were heavy, and the bodies that moved them paid for the moving, and any account that pretended otherwise would be a lie. But look closer at the breaks, because there are breaks, of course, in people who spent their lives among moving stone, fractured arms and legs, bones snapped by a slip or a load that shifted. And every one of those breaks that a person survived is healed. Healed clean. Healed straight. Not the ugly crooked knitting of a bone left to mend however it will, twisted and shortened, the way a broken limb heals in a body that no one tended, but set, properly set, the two ends drawn back into true and held there, aligned by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and very likely splintered, bound up and supported through the long slow weeks that a bone takes to knit, and tended across all those weeks by hands that knew the craft. And there is more, and it is the part that stops the heart of the old story altogether. There are skeletons here of people who survived amputations, men who lost a hand or a leg cut away and a lost limb. In nearly every place and time where human beings were held cheap was a death sentence, a wound that killed you slowly by the bleeding or swiftly by the rot. And these amputations did not kill. They were done cleanly, the limb taken off by someone with skill and a steady purpose. The wound cared for and watched until it closed and healed over, and the person lived on. The bones show years of further life after the limb was gone. A man with one hand or one leg who has not turned out to die when he could no longer haul on a rope, but held within the community that his own work had already cost him a hand or a leg. Sheltered and provisioned and carried by the very people he had worked beside. There was medicine on that plateau. Real medicine, real physicians attached to the workforce, setting fractures and dressing wounds and taking off ruined limbs with care and bringing them through. And giving that care not to princes, but to the ordinary men and women who moved the blocks. And so let me land the plainest sentence I have for you tonight, and then let it simply rest. No slave cemetery on earth looks like this. Nowhere in all the long and sorrowful archaeology of human bondage, in all the mass graves and pauper pits into which enslaved and despised people have been tipped across the whole grim history of our kind, does anyone find splintered and carefully set bones, and prime rations of good bread and beer laid in for the journey, and proud job titles carved on little false doors, and miniature copies of the tombs of kings, and an eternity granted in the holy ground beside the monument itself? That is not how you bury people you despise. That is not how you dispose of tools that have worn out. Splintered bones, good food, proud titles, nearness to the king, these are the marks of people who were valued, honoured, mourned by their own, and laid to rest with hope and dignity and care. These are workers honoured, not victims discarded. And once the horse's stumbling hoof has broken the sand open and shown you the little mud mastabas with their tiny ramps, and the healed arms, and the carved words of a man proud to have overseen the masonry, the old picture of the groaning slave beneath the lash simply cannot be put back together again. It comes apart in your hands, gently, and it does not go back. And yet the old story is not quite asleep even now, and there is one whisper of it left, and perhaps you can hear it too, lying there in the dark, because the whisper says, yes, very well. Not slaves then, paid men, fed men, honoured men, buried with their titles and their beer, I grant you all of it. But 6 million tons, 6 million tons of stone. Farmers with copper chisels soft enough to blunt on a fingernail, and ropes twisted from marsh reeds, and their own bare backs, and no wheel and no iron and no engine of any kind. Lifting a mountain, block by block, 40 stories into the sky. Honoured, yes paid, yes cared for, yes, but how? How did they actually do it? And that whisper, unlike the first, is not a slander, and I will not wave it away, because it is a fair and honest wonder, the fairest in the whole subject, and it deserves a fair and honest answer. So let me promise you only this. As the moon moves over the graves, the answer needs no lost civilization, and no vanished machine, and no visitors from the stars, and no secret that has been kept from you. It needs only water, and sand, and rope, and wood, and the slow ordinary cleverness of a great many people working patiently together, and we are going to walk through the whole of it, gently, in the morning light, taking the mountain apart in our minds one easy step at a time. And the answer to that, whispered how when it comes not as a machine and not as a mystery, but as a sound, and I would like you to hear it before you see anything at all. So let the picture stay dark a little longer, and only listen. It is dawn on the Giza plateau, 4,500 years ago, and the light has not yet quite crested the eastern desert. The air is still cool, and out across the great pale shelf of rock the work has already begun. And the sound of it, the thing I would have you carry down into sleep in place of every whip that was ever cracked over this plateau in a film you half remember, is hundreds upon hundreds of rounded stones being lifted in 2 hands and brought down upon the bedrock again and again, not all together, not in one great blow, but scattered right across the quarry in their hundreds, each in its own unhurried rhythm, so that the blows overlap and blur and roll into one another until the whole hollow of the quarry rings, softly, steadily, like a field of slow bells heard from very far off across water. That is the sound of the Great Pyramid being made. Not a scream, not the groan of some lost engine. Only the patient, overlapping, almost musical knocking of stone upon stone in the cool of the morning, the sound of skilled hands warming to their ordinary work, hundreds of them, as the sun comes up. And if you can hold that sound, the field of slow bells, the dawn quarry ringing, then you already understand, in your body, more of the truth of this place than a whole century of people reaching for aliens ever managed to feel. Now let me take the number that frightens people and set it down gently on the table. The Great Pyramid is built of something like 2.33 million blocks, and the average block weighs about 2.5 tons, a delivery van sitting in the road, a young elephant leaning its whole weight against you, and there are 2.33 million of them stacked into a mountain 40 stories high. And Khufu reigned, we think, somewhere around 20 years, and let us do the sum slowly, the way you might count sheep over a low fence. 20 years is a little over 7,300 days. 2.33 million blocks spread across those days comes to something like 300 blocks laid every single day. And if the men work 10 hours of daylight, that is 30 blocks an hour, one block set roughly, every 2 or 3 minutes, day after day, for 20 years without stopping. And there it is, the very number that makes people go quiet and reach for something from the stars, because when you say it like that, 1 2.5-ton stone lifted and carried and set every 2 minutes for 20 years, it sounds like the work of gods, or of nobody human at all. So let me answer it, softly, the way you would answer a child who has frightened themselves in the dark. It was never 1 block every 2 minutes. It was never 1 team, 1 ramp, 1 impossible clock ticking down at the pyramid's single edge. It was 30 blocks an hour up 30 different paths in 30 different teams' hands, all at once, all around the growing mountain, gangs on the north face and the south and the west. One team levering a stone into its bed while the next is already halfway up the ramp behind it, and a third is still down in the quarry, marking the seam of the one that will follow. A block every 2 minutes is a terror when you picture one exhausted man. A block every 2 minutes is a Tuesday morning when you picture a railway station, the trains arriving and leaving on every platform. A departure every few seconds, impossible for one man to run and entirely ordinary the moment you allow a timetable, and gangs, and someone whose whole job is to keep the flow moving. The Great Pyramid is not one man doing the impossible. It is a great many ordinary men doing the possible in parallel on a schedule for a long time. Now let us take the making apart into its 3 plain movements, the cutting, the moving, and the raising, because in the taking apart the mountain stops being a miracle and becomes a morning's work. First, the cutting, and here I must gently correct the picture of long lines of stone dragged from somewhere far away across the burning sand. Because the great mass of the pyramid, the vast rough inner body of it, the millions of ordinary yellowish blocks that make up nearly the whole of the bulk, was not brought from far away at all. It was quarried right there, on the spot, from the plateau itself, a few hundred paces from where it was being laid. And you can still go and stand today in the very place it came from, a great open hollow in the rock just to the south of the pyramid, a quarried-out basin the size of the works themselves, which is one of the quietest and most astonishing sights on the whole plateau, because it is the empty space the pyramid used to be. The mountain and the hole it came out of side by side, the fullness and the absence matched. The stone did not travel. It simply moved across the road, so to speak, from the hollow where it slept in the ground to the mountain where it would sleep in the air. And how was it cut? The quarryman would come to the clean face of the rock and read it the way a person who knows their trade reads their material, looking for the bedding planes, the natural horizontal seams where the limestone had laid itself down, layer on layer, over unthinkable ages of ancient sea. Because a stone worked along its own grain gives itself up so much more kindly than a stone fought against it. And having read the seam, he would mark out his block, and then the pounding began. The dolorite hammerstones, hard, dark, rounded cobbles of a stone tougher than the limestone it bit into, lifted and brought down, wearing a channel around the block, dust rising. A boy perhaps kept busy sweeping the powdered stone out of the groove so the men could see their line. And where they needed a finer edge, they had copper chisels, soft metal that dulled almost as fast as they could use it, so that behind the labour of the quarry stood another quieter labour, a constant coming and going of blunted chisels carried back to be resharpened and returned, hundreds circulating through the smith's hands like cutlery in some enormous kitchen, going out clean, coming back dull, all day. And when the block was cut round on its sides and needed only to be freed from the living rock beneath it, they would drive wooden levers down into sockets cut for the purpose, a line of men laying hold of the timbers and leaning their weight into them together, and there would come a good, satisfying moment when the seam gave, and the stone parted from the earth that had held it since the beginning of the world with a low crack you would feel come up through the soles of your sandals. That is a block cut. And nearly all of them, the whole vast body of the thing, came just like that, from just there. There were only two exceptions, and they are worth knowing, because they are the parts that did travel, and travel far. The first is the fine white casing, for the pyramid was once sheathed, top to bottom, in a smooth skin of beautiful pale limestone so white and so finely dressed that it must have blazed in the sun like something lit from within. And that casing stone did not come from the plateau. It was quarried across the river at a place called Tura, and ferried over the Nile on barges, block after block, to be carried up and set as the gleaming outer face. And I will only flag it lightly for you now, and let it wait, because the man who did exactly this, who moved the white Tura stone across the water for the skin of the Great Pyramid, is waiting for us at the very end of the night. And the second exception is grander still, high inside the pyramid. Roofing the great chamber where the king was to lie, there are beams of red granite, enormous ones, some weighing something like 50 tons apiece, one stone the weight of 20 of the ordinary blocks, and that granite does not occur anywhere near Giza. It was quarried at Aswan, far to the south, some 500 miles up the river, and floated all the way down on the great yearly flood. Beam after 50-ton beam, a journey of hundreds of miles by water for each one, simply to roof a single room. Sit with that patience for a moment, the willingness to float a 50-ton stone the length of a country to put a proper ceiling over a king. That is the cutting. Now, the moving. How do you take a 2.5-ton block, or a 50-ton beam, and shift it across the ground? And here is where the missing wheel comes in, and the answer to it. Because people love to say the Egyptians had no wheel, and it is nearly true and beside the point both at once, for even had they owned the finest wheel in the world it would have done them little good, because a narrow wheel under a heavy load in soft desert sand does not roll, it digs. It ploughs itself down and stops. So they did not fight the sand with wheels, they used the sledge. Simply that, a sturdy sledge of oiled wood with two long curved runners, the load lashed on top, and teams of men on ropes hauling it forward, and this is not a guess. We have found the sledges, real ones dug up out of the dry sand where they were left, oiled wood preserved by the desert across the thousands of years. And we have found the picture of it too, which is one of my favourite things in all of this, because it solves a small riddle that hid in plain sight. In a tomb at a place called Deir el-Bersha there is a wall painting showing a colossal statue being dragged along on exactly such a sledge, with long files of haulers on the ropes, and standing right at the front, just ahead of the runners, there is one single man, and he is not pulling. He is bending, and pouring water from a jar onto the sand directly in the path the sledge is about to travel. And for a very long time scholars looked at that little figure and thought, well, that must be something ceremonial, a ritual libation, because why on earth would you pour water on the sand in front of a sledge? And then, Only a few years ago, in 2014, a group of physicists in Amsterdam did the plainest, most beautiful little experiment. They took a small sledge and a tray of sand, and they measured precisely how hard you have to pull to drag it, and they varied only one thing: how wet the sand was. And what they found is that dry sand is terrible. It piles up in front of the runners into a little dune the sledge must climb forever, ploughing and heaping. But sand that is damp, wetted just so, not soaked, not muddy, but dampened to just the right degree, behaves entirely differently, because the little films of water form tiny bridges between the grains that hold them together and stiffen the whole surface into something firm, so that the sledge glides over a hard, smooth road instead of ploughing through a loose one. And the force needed to pull the load dropped by something like half. By half. So that man at the front of the painting, dismissed for 100 years as pouring out a little religious water, was doing the single most important technical job on the whole team. He was making the road. He was, with nothing but a jar of water and the knowledge of exactly how much to pour, turning the loose and hopeless desert into a firm and gliding highway just ahead of the stone, so that the desert itself became the machine that moved the mountain. And I love that the water pourer turns out to be the engineer. I will be honest and say we cannot swear every crew wet the sand on every haul, and some of the moving was surely over prepared trackways of other kinds, but the principle is sound, it is measured, it is real, and it asks for no lost civilization, only for people who had learned, as people do, exactly how their own desert behaved under a heavy load. That is the moving. And now the last and hardest of the three, the raising, the part that truly makes people throw up their hands, because it is one thing to slide a stone along the flat ground, and quite another to lift it into the sky, block on block, to the height of a 40-story tower. And the answer, the main answer, is the humblest thing imaginable. It is a ramp. A ramp of earth and rubble and brick, built up against the growing side of the pyramid, up which the sledges were hauled, so that the men never truly lifted the stones at all, they only ever dragged them up a slope, which is a thing human muscle understands. And the ramp is not merely a theory somebody dreamed up to make the sums work. Ramps are a thing we have actually dug up, left standing against other unfinished pyramids, where the builders stopped before taking their ramps away. And only a few years ago, in 2018, at a quarry called Hatnub, they uncovered a real ramp from Khufu's own time, a steep central ramp with a staircase running up each side of it, and set along those staircases, at intervals, holes for stout wooden posts. And when you see the posts you understand the cleverness of it, because a rope run around a fixed post becomes a simple machine. It lets the men on one side pull downward while the load on the other side goes up, so that a team could haul a stone up a far steeper slope than the cautious old estimates had ever allowed. It is not magic, it is rope and timber and a post to turn the rope around, and men who understood leverage in their hands and their shoulders long before anyone wrote the physics of it down. And now I must pay the honesty contract at its very sharpest point, because I promised that where the evidence ran out I would tell you plainly, and here is where it thins. For the fat lower half of the pyramid the ramps answer beautifully, and remember that a pyramid is bottom heavy in a way that flatters the builder. Because more than half of all that stone is already in place by the time you have reached only a third of the way up, the base is broad, and the going is, relatively, easy. It is the top that troubles us. As the mountain narrows toward its peak, the platform you are working on shrinks, and the ramp, to keep a gentle enough slope, would have to grow absurdly long and high just to serve a smaller and smaller target, until the ramp itself would be a greater work than the thing it served. And so, for that last third, up to the setting of the final capstone. How they did it precisely we genuinely do not know. There are honest, sober candidates, and I will lay them gently before you. Perhaps a ramp that wrapped around the outside of the pyramid, spiralling up its four faces as it climbed, perhaps up there. They set the ramps aside and raised each block the last short distances by levering it up story by story. Rocking it up one course at a time on timbers, perhaps there was an internal ramp built into the body of the pyramid itself and hidden inside the masonry, spiralling upward within, an idea some have argued for. And the plain truth is that no one has ever proven a single one of these, and the top of the Great Pyramid remains a genuine open question. But I would ask you to feel that not knowing is an open room and not a locked one. It is not a door slammed in our faces with a secret hidden malevolently behind it. It is simply a room we have not yet finished walking through, a bright and airy room full of reasonable possibilities, any of which a clever, tired, unhurried people with rope and timber and time could have managed. And we are only waiting to learn which. Not knowing how they raised the last third is not the same as needing gods to have done it. It is just the ordinary, comfortable edge of what the evidence has so far shown us. And if you are finding a deep sort of peace in lying here while an old question turns slowly over in the mind, asking nothing of you, then do stay with us by the lamp and settle in, for there is a new one of these each week, another old wonder to lie down beside and let carry you off. Now, before we leave the making, I want to give you one last wonder, the quietest of all, the one the people who cry aliens somehow never seem to mention, and it is not the weight of the stones at all, but the precision. Consider the base. The pyramid stands on a footprint of some 13 acres, a great square platform of bedrock the size of many football fields. And that platform was cut and levelled so that its whole vast surface is flat to within a couple of centimetres, an inch or so, across that entire enormous spread of ground, one corner to another. Across 13 acres, the height barely varies by the width of your 2 fingers. And they did that most likely with nothing more than water, cutting shallow channels across the rock and flooding them, and using the perfectly level surface that still water always finds as their guide. A mark scored at the waterline, the channels drained, and the high spots patiently cut down to match. Over and over, with an unhurried and unbelievably patient eye. Water, a cord, and time. And then, having levelled it, they set the whole mountain square to the world. The 4 sides of the Great Pyramid are aligned to the 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, and aligned not roughly but almost perfectly, true north, within a small fraction of a single degree, a nearness that surveyors with fine modern instruments respect. And they had no compass. There was no compass in the world, no needle to find the north for them. They found it, we believe, by watching the sky, by sighting the slow wheel of the stars around the northern point of the heavens, taking with a plumb line hung true and a simple sighting rod the point midway between where a northern star rose and where it set, and calling that north, and trusting it. Patience, a weighted string, a notched stick, and the turning stars. And I will say this to you plainly, and then let it go, because I think it is the truest sentence I can offer against the whole sad business of doubting these people. A civilization that can find true north with a piece of string does not need aliens. It needs its due. It needs, from us, at long last, the simple respect of being believed. And so we have taken the mountain apart into its 3 slow movements. The cutting from the hollow that is the pyramid's own empty shape, the moving on wetted sand behind a man with a water jar, the raising up the ramp with rope turned round a post, and admitted freely the one place, the narrowing top, where we simply do not yet know. And every single thing I have shown you tonight is true, and checkable, and real. And yet there is one thing missing from every last piece of it. Every witness we have called tonight is mute. The bones with their healed fractures, the red gang name above the king's chamber, the ovens and the fish and cattle bones, the oiled sledge, the painting of the water pourer, the ramp at Hatnab, the empty quarry that is the pyramid's own missing shape, every one of them speaks clearly, and not one of them has a voice. We have been reading the plateau like a room full of objects left behind by people who have stepped out, and not one of those people has yet opened his mouth and spoken to us in his own words, in the first person, as one tired human being telling another what his day was like. All of it is testimony, and none of it is speech. But there was one man, one ordinary, careful, tired man, a middle sort of man with a middle sort of job, who sat down with a reed pen and a cake of ink, day after day, and wrote it all down, where he went, and what he carried, and where he slept, through the seasons of the work, and whose logbook, against all the odds of 4,500 years, survived, and we have already seen it. It is the very papyrus we watched come sliding out of the desert wall at the harbour of Wadi al-Jarf at the very beginning of this night, when we did not yet know what it was or why it should matter. So let us go back now, back across all these hours, to the little bay on the shore of the Red Sea where we started, and let us at last do the one thing we could not do at the beginning. Let us go back to the sea, and open his book, and let him speak. And so we come back to the sea, back to that lonely curve of the Red Sea shore at Wadi al-Jarf, with its rows of man-made caves cut into the hillside, and its stone jetty reaching out into the shallows. And the first thing you notice, coming back, is that the wind has not stopped. It has not stopped since we left it. All this long while, all through the town of the bakers and the middens of the bones, and the graffiti on the wall, and the sledge upon the wet sand, the wind here has gone on blowing off the water and over the stone exactly as it was blowing when we set out, patient, tireless, saying the same soft thing to the same empty shore, and there is a comfort in that, in coming back to find the wind still at its work, the way you come home late and find the one lamp still burning that you left burning. And now, at last, we may do the thing we could not do at the very beginning, the thing I told you then we were not yet ready for. Do you remember? I set a rolled papyrus before you at the start, and said we would come back to it at the end, when we had walked the whole of the plateau and learnt to read it, when we had earned the right to hear a man speak, and we have walked it now, all of it, the quarry and the ramp and the ovens and the graves, and so we have earned it, and the man is waiting, and it is time. Let me take the papyrus up, then, gently, the way you would lift something 4,600 years old, and unroll it in the lamplight, and tell you what it is, because it is, in the plainest words, the oldest inscribed papyrus that has ever been found anywhere on the face of the earth. Older writing exists, scratched in clay, cut in stone, but of writing set down in ink upon a sheet of papyrus, the true ancestor of every page and every letter and every book that has ever been, this is the eldest that has come down to us, and it comes out of the wall of a desert cave. And the astonishing thing, the thing that stops the breath a little when you first see it, is that the ink is still black. Still black. After 4,500 years in the dark of the stone, the marks a man made with a reed pen are as clear as if he had set the pen down an hour ago, and beside the black there is red. For the scribe worked in two colours, as the good scribes always did. Black for the body of his entries, red for the headings and the dates, red to mark where a new reckoning began. The way you or I might underline a thing. And the hand is not the grand and careful hieroglyphic carving you see marching across a temple wall. It is the everyday kind, the quick-running, joined-up shorthand a working scribe used when he had a great deal to get down and no time to make it beautiful, the ancient equivalent of a hand, scrawled fast in a notebook. And here is the detail that undoes me, the small thing that tells you everything about what kind of document this truly is. It is ruled. It is ruled into a table. The scribe took his sheet and drew lines down it and across it, columns and rows, a neat grid of little boxes, and into the boxes he wrote his entries, one to a day, day after day in their order, so that what you are looking at, this oldest of all written pages, this priceless relic dug from a wall on the shore of the Red Sea, is a table, a grid of days. It is paperwork. And that is the wonder of it, and the whole quiet argument of the night made flesh, because paperwork is the most ordinary kind of writing there is, and therefore the most trustworthy kind of writing there is. No one keeps a false timesheet for the glory of the gods. No one rules a grid of days and fills it in box by box in order to deceive the future. A hymn may flatter, an inscription may boast, A king's monument may lie about a battle he lost, but a logbook, a plain working record of what was done on which day, has no motive but to be right, because its only reader was meant to be the man's own overseer, checking the tally at the end of the month. It is true the way a receipt is true. So the most reliable witness to the building of the Great Pyramid turns out to be not a poem and not a proclamation, but a foreman's paperwork, kept because it had to be kept, and thrown into a cave and forgotten, and waiting there in the dark with its ink still black for us to come at last and read. Now let me tell you about the man who ruled that grid, because he has a name, and after a whole night of nameless thousands, it means a great deal, I find, to be able at last to say a name. His name was Mira, and he was, by his own account, an inspector, which is to say a foreman, a middle manager, a man neither at the top nor at the bottom of the great work, but somewhere in its patient middle, with people above him to answer to and people below him to keep, and the people below him were a gang, a work team of something on the order of 40 men, and I want you to feel the click of that number as it falls into place, because we have met it before tonight. 40 men. Do you remember the red paint up in the cramped dark above the king's chamber? The crew names daubed on the blocks by the gangs who set them, the friends of Khufu, the drunkards of Menkore, the proud rough signatures of teams of workers just this size? Mera led a gang exactly like those. And so here, at the very end of the night, two kinds of writing reach across the plateau and take hold of one another. The paint and the ink shake hands, the boastful red daub on the hidden stone and the neat black grid on the desert papyrus turn out to be the two voices of the very same thing, the ordinary working gang of ancient Egypt, one shouting its name where it thought no one would ever look, the other quietly keeping its books, and both of them, across 4,500 years, saying the same homely thing, which is, we were here, and we were men, and this was our work. And the papyrus tells us when. It dates itself, as an Egyptian document does, not by a number of years, but by the reign of the king, and it sets itself down in the year after the 13th cattle count of Khufu, which is to say near enough around the 27th year of his rule, late in it, late in the whole vast enterprise. And that placing matters more than almost anything, because it means that when Mera was writing, the Great Pyramid was very nearly finished. The mountain was up. The 2.5 million blocks were, in the main, already lifted and laid. What was left, in these last years, was the final and most delicate act of the whole thing, the dressing of the mountain in its skin, the casing of that vast rough core in a smooth outer garment of fine white limestone, the beautiful pale Chura stone brought across the river to sheathe the pyramid so that it would rise off the plateau not as a stepped heap of blocks, but as a single blinding shape of polished white. And that white stone, that final skin, is the stone that Mera's 40 men carried. That is what his logbook is a log of. We have caught him, and his gang, in the last act of the greatest building on earth, at the work of wrapping it in its whiteness. So let us read his week, slowly, at our pace, and not at his, because he was in a hurry, and we are not. He had a tally to keep and a tide to catch, and we have nothing to do tonight but drift. The Egyptian week was not 7 days, but 10, a run of 10 days worked and then a rest, and Mera kept his log across these 10-day weeks, a line to a day, and what the lines say over and over in their neat-ruled boxes is the plainest thing imaginable, and therefore the most miraculous. They are a timesheet. They say, on such a day, we were at the quarry of Tura South, loading the stone. They say, we cast off, the boat laden and bound downriver for Akhet Khufu, for the horizon of Khufu. They say, we spent the night at Shey Khufu, at the pool of Khufu, the great basin dug near the plateau to bring the stone almost to the pyramid's foot. They say, we spent the night at the horizon of Khufu. They say we sailed back upriver, empty now, to load again. And then it begins over. Load at Tura, cast off for the horizon, a night at the pool. a night at the horizon. Sail back and load again. 2 round trips in a week, sometimes 3, 40 men and a boat and a river and a cargo of white stone, back and forth, ferrying the skin of the pyramid across the water load by load. And the thing that catches in the throat is not how strange it is, but how utterly unstrange. How completely and boringly familiar. Because this is a commute. This is a working man's commute. Written down by the working man himself in his own neat columns. The going out and the coming back and the nights away from home, and the same run made again and again till the job is done. And there is not one soul listening to me tonight who has not in their own life filled in a sheet exactly like this one. 4,500 years fall away, and it is just a man logging his week. And rest especially on the delivery address, because it is the most extraordinary phrase on the whole page, and Mira writes it as casually as you would write the name of the depot you drive to. Akhet Khufu. The horizon of Khufu. That was the pyramid's own name, the name the Egyptians gave the building itself, and Mera names it as his destination, the address he was delivering to, and if you stood where he stood, at the steering oar of that laden boat coming in across the water, you would have seen it there ahead of you, growing as you neared it, the white casing creeping up its flanks course by course. And, if you looked closely, the tiny figures of the gang still crawling upon it, still setting the topmost stones, the building not yet finished, still being made before his eyes as he brought it the very stone it was being finished with. Do you understand what that means? It means these plain ruled lines, this timesheet, this commute, are the only eyewitness account of the building of the Great Pyramid that exists anywhere on the face of the earth. The only one. Out of all the millions who must have seen it rise, out of the whole 20 years of it, this one tired inspector, keeping his books because he had to, is the single human voice that comes down to us saying, I was there, I saw it, I carried the stone, and here is the day I did it. And folded in with the diary, on the same sheets, are the accounts, the rations, the reckoning of what the men were given, the last receipt of the night, the ink confirming everything the ash and the bones had already told us, for Mera set down the issues of grain, and of flour, and of good bread, and of beer, and of dates, and of vegetables. The food doled out to keep his 40 men fed and working, and bolts of cloth besides, textile issued and counted, serving almost as a kind of money, and there it is, written down 4,500 years ago by the man who handed it out, the plain black proof of the thing this whole night has been circling toward, that what these men received for their labour was not the lash, but the loaf. Not chains, but rations, not a whip, but a wage. And above Mera there was a boss, for a middle manager always has a boss, and the papyrus names him too. And this is perhaps the most wonderful turn of all, because it means the whole chain of command survives, checkable, link by link, up into the daylight of the great unnamed. Mera reports in his diary to the overseer of the works, the man in charge of the harbour and the hauling of the stone. And that man is named, and his name is Ankaf. And Ankaf was no shadowy figure but one of the greatest men in the kingdom, a prince, the king's own half-brother, a vizier, a supreme administrator, the sort of man to whom the running of a nation's largest labour could be handed, and we do not merely have his name, we have his face. For Ankaf's tomb stands at Giza to this day, a great mastaba near the pyramid he helped to raise, and out of it came a portrait of him, a bust modelled in the round, painted, startlingly real, not an idealised god-king with a blank perfect stare, but a particular ageing man with heavy lids and a full jaw and a look of tired competence upon him. The face of someone who has carried a great deal of responsibility for a long time and knows exactly how much a thing weighs, and that bust survives, and you may go and stand before it today in a museum in Boston and look into the real, tired, particular human face of the man who is Mera's boss, from the tired inspector filling his grid by lamplight up to the tired prince whose face you can meet across a museum gallery. The whole ladder of the work survives, human at every rung, and what it shows you, past any more arguing, is that the most mysterious building on Earth was raised by the least mysterious force there is, administration. Ordinary ledger kept administration, boats and rations and rosters and a chain of tired men each answering to the one above. Not magic, not machines from the sky, not the groaning of a million slaves, but management. The oldest paperwork in the world proving that the pyramid was in the end a project, run the way projects are run, by people keeping track. And here, one last time, gently, I must lay the honesty of the night back on the table. Mera's diary proves the system. It proves the rations and the boats and the gangs and the harbour and the chain of command. It proves, past doubt, who these people were and how they were fed and paid and ordered. But it says nothing, not one word, about how the stones went up. Mera logged the carrying of the casing. He did not draw us the ramp. The papyrus leaves the last question, the how of the raising, exactly where we left it, in the open, unlocked room we may walk about in without dread. It hands us the men and withholds the method, and that is more than all right, because we have the men, and the men were always the harder thing to find, and the method will keep. So let me give you now the final answer to the question the whole night set out to ask, and let me give it not as an argument, but as a litany, a slow telling over of the receipts, the way you might count something soft and known in the dark until you fall asleep. Who built the Great Pyramid? Not slaves. Say it plainly, and then hear all the evidence say it with you. The bakeries, in their dozens, black with the ash of a state feeding its workers well, say not slaves. The breweries beside them say not slaves. The bones of the prime beef, the best cattle in Egypt hauled up the plateau to feed the labourers meat, say not slaves. The healed fractures, the broken arms set straight and knitted whole by careful hands, say not slaves. The graves themselves, the honoured tombs of the workers laid to rest in the shadow of the thing they built, buried with bread and beer for their own eternity in sight of the kings, say not slaves. And who then, if not slaves? Not gods, who needed no bakeries, not lost machines that left no part behind, not visitors from anywhere, who would not have paused to bake bread and set broken arms and daub proud names on hidden stone. People, only ever people. The farmers who came in their rotating gangs when the flood lay over their fields, and went home again to their villages when the waters fell. The hundreds of bakers and brewers in the smoke, turning grain into wages. The bone setters who mended the hurt. The surveyors who found true north with a string. The proud rough gangs who called themselves the Friends of Khufu and left their name where they thought only the gods would read it. And one tired inspector named Mera, out on the river with his 40 men and his cargo of white stone, filling in the little boxes of his diary by the light of a lamp, night after night, so that 4,500 years later, we would know. It was people, and when the great work was at last finished, when Mera's boats had brought the last of the white stone, and the last casing block was dressed and polished, and the pyramid stood complete and blinding on its plateau, sheathed head to foot in gleaming Chura limestone, so smooth and bright that under the sun it must have looked less like a building than like a shape cut out of pure light. The white skin stayed. It stayed for 3,000 years. Think of that span. The whole of ancient Egypt's long life ran out beneath that white casing, and the Greeks came, and the Romans came, and still it shone. And then, far down the ages, in medieval times, great earthquakes shook the land of Egypt and loosened the ancient casing on its slopes, cracked it, and set it free. And the people of a growing city near at hand, the people of Cairo, did the sensible and human thing that people have always done with good cut stone lying loose and to hand. They took it. They carried the white casing away, block by block, down off the plateau and into the city, and built it into their walls and their gates and the great fine mosques of Cairo. And it is there still. The skin of the pyramid, dressed now into the stone of the city, so that in a way I find quietly perfect, Cairo is wearing the pyramid, the white garment came down off the mountain, and the living city put it on. And this means something tender for you and me tonight. because it means the stone is not all locked away behind a rope, a walker in Cairo today, an ordinary person on an ordinary street, may without ever knowing it rest a hand against a block of pale limestone in an old wall that was quarried at Tura and ferried across the river, and loaded, perhaps, one bright spring morning in the 27th year of Khufu, by a gang of 40 tired men whose foreman wrote the day down in his diary. The stone is out among us. It is being touched all the time. And I cannot help thinking, as we come to the close, of Herodotus, the old Greek traveller who stood before this pyramid and asked, as everyone asks, who built it and how, and who was told, and who wrote down. The story of the driven multitudes, the toiling slaves, the whip. And he was not lying, and he was not foolish. He simply came too late. 2,000 years too late, 2,000 years after Mera, and asked his questions of people who no longer knew the answer, and told him the story that made sense to their own hard age, and he wrote it down, and the world believed it for another 2,500 years. And it took, in the end, the smallest and most patient of accidents to begin to catch the error. A horse stumbling upon the plateau, where the sand had hidden a hollow, a narrow gap noticed between two blocks in a desert cliff, a cave giving up its rolls of blackened papyrus. Little things. Quiet things. The truth waiting all that while just under the surface to be tripped over by someone who happened. At last to look, and there is a lesson in that, the gentlest of lessons to carry down into sleep, a lesson in how patient the truth is prepared to be, how long it will lie quiet under the sand and the false story, in no hurry at all, perfectly content to wait 4,500 years for the one stumbling step that turns it up into the light. And now, softly, softly, we come to the end of the night, and there is nothing left to explain, nothing left to prove, nothing left for you to hold or to follow. There is only the resting. So let me give you the last few pictures to lie down among as you drift, and let them be soft ones. Think of the red paint, the crew names up in the sealed dark above the king's chamber, and how they are still red, still fresh, still bright as the day the gang daubed them. And why? Because no light has ever touched them, because they were closed into the dark, and the dark kept them. And darkness, it turns out, is the thing that keeps, the great gentle preserver. The same darkness that kept the ink black on Mera's page, and the carvings sharp under Göbekli's hill, and that is keeping you, now wrapped soft and safe and whole, in your own warm dark tonight. Think of the builders themselves, asleep in their small tombs at the foot of the plateau, laid down these 4,500 years facing the great monument they chose, deliberately to look upon forever, content, it seems, to spend their eternity in the sight of the thing they made. Think of the pyramid standing over them in the night, and of how, if you laid your hand upon its stone at midnight, you would feel it faintly warm still, warm with the day's heat given slowly back, as it has given it back every single night for 4,600 years, the patient old stone breathing out by dark the warmth it drank in by light, keeping its long faithful watch over the plain. And now fold the whole of this long night down into one small thing you can carry over the edge of sleep with you, one line, light enough to hold as everything else lets go. It was people. It was always people. That is the whole of it. Not slaves, not gods, not machines, not mystery. People. Fed and paid and healed and named and counted and remembered. People exactly like the ones who raised every good thing that has ever been raised. People exactly like you. Hold that and let the rest go. Let your shoulders come down now that last small distance they have been waiting to come down, all the way down, and let them stay. Let the jaw unclench. Let your hands lie open. Let your breath go long and slow, and find its own soft rhythm without your minding it at all. Let it find its own quiet water the way the boats found the channel. Easily. Downstream. Carried. You do not have to steer it. You may let go of the oar. If you are drifting now, if the words are beginning to come apart and go soft and run together and mean less and matter less, that is not you failing to listen, that is the story doing its work, that is exactly and only what it was for, and you should let it, you should go, you have earned it as surely as we earned the papyrus, and there is nothing more to stay awake for. The work is done, the mountain is finished and clad in its white light. The men have brought the last stone in across the water, and made their marks, and eaten their bread, and gone to their rest, and their foreman has closed his diary and set down his pen, and the wind on the shore at Wadi el-Jarf is still blowing, patient, tireless, keeping the one lamp burning. Sleep now. The people who raised it are keeping the watch over the plateau, and just for tonight, over you as well. Good night.